Sup, freaks? This episode is brought to you by our good friends at River. The last few months have shown us that it's really hard to find a reliable partner in the Bitcoin space that can get you access to Bitcoin, help you purchase Bitcoin, help you mine Bitcoin, and help you send that Bitcoin to cold storage. Third-party dependencies like Prime Trust are security holes. Luckily, with River, they built their whole exchange. They built their infrastructure. They built their wallets. They built their multi-sig cold storage. Their Bitcoin that is held on their exchange is backed one-to-one in that multi-sig cold storage, though they do encourage you to take self-custody of your Bitcoin. If you DCA, if you dollar cost average, you're not going to pay any fees on those buys. Other exchanges have insane fees and spreads on DCA purchases. You can avoid that using River. Go to river.com/TFTC, set up that account today, and pick your last Bitcoin partner, the most reliable one. River.com/TFTC. Enjoy this episode. Kody.
Marty.
It's a pleasure hanging last weekend. It's a pleasure hanging.
Yeah, it's like always fun to meet your heroes, especially when they live up to it, So
Oh, stop that. I know it was. I mean, I've heard a lot about you and all the work that you're doing at Fedi in incorporating Bitcoin into AI, and yeah, you did live up to the hype, man.
Oh well, you did too, Barney. If anyone is listening to this instead of watching this, Marty's been packing on a lot of muscle recently, and it's one of the most surprising things when you meet him. You're like, whoa, like Marty, you're a lot like stockier, like much bigger build than you are on coming through my headphones.
I come from a family of mongoloids. It's all natural. I do try to supplement it with some weightlifting. It was leg day today.
Excellent.
Did some box deadlifts. Felt good.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, freaks, if you can hear the rain in the background. It's torrential downpour here on the back porch studio here in South Jersey. But I'm extremely excited for this conversation because the convergence of Bitcoin and AI, particularly Bitcoin over the Lightning Network and AI, is something I think could be massive for Bitcoin adoption and just the usability of the internet overall. I think AI is just one particular use case. Yeah. The gods agree. They're sending us a message right now that we're onto something here. But before we dive into all that, we were chatting a little bit before we hit record about your background in the military and how you came to understand Bitcoin a bit intuitively. Like, how'd you go from being a Marine to working at Fedi on the cutting edge of Bitcoin, the Lightning Network, and AI?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marty. So give a 2-minute summary. So I was an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. When I was finishing up active time, was when coronavirus happened. And so because we were this was very, very early when it first started, was we were on deployment and we were getting stuck in these hey, you got 2 weeks stuck in your room, or we were having these while you're on watch, you have to be hey, you got 12 hours on watch or 24 hours on watch while you're in the tactical operations center. And normally you're waiting for the phone to ring and we're going to jump on a bunch of birds. We're going to fly to Syria or wherever it is. And but because coronavirus was happening, not a lot of stuff was going on. Not a lot of phones were ringing. And so what I ended up doing was started reading a lot more and found Bitcoin was one of the things that wasn't blocked on government computers, like bitcoin.org. And so my first kind of intro into Bitcoin was this is one of the few things I can read while I'm on watch, sort of waiting for stuff to happen. And so started going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. One of the things that was kind of immediately intuitive to me, and why I kind of went down Bitcoin versus altcoins, because after you read Bitcoin, you start talking to people about it, they bring up all the altcoins and you sort of look at it, was the proof of work aspect of it. And I know that you've had some conversations with Jason Lowry, and while I don't agree with him on everything, I think that there's some really valuable stuff that he's been doing in terms of framing Bitcoin's proof of work in language that can really appeal to people with sort of military backgrounds. And so that was one of the things for me, I wasn't able to exactly identify it, but once you kind of came on the scene, being able to see that, yes, the same maneuver warfare language that we use in the Marine Corps, sort of applies within Bitcoin as the importance of proof of work, right? The way that Bitcoin establishes, hey, you actually have to work in order to combat it, those sorts of things. And then coming out of the Marine Corps, I started working on Bitcoin development because one of the cultural aspects of the the Marine Corps I really enjoyed was, and that made it really like such a great organization, was because every Marine was a rifleman, right? Is that if you look at the ranks for Marines, like one of the differences between us and the other services is that you've got cross rifles on it. Because first and foremost, every Marine is a rifleman. And the reason why is because insofar as you're in this organization, insofar as you're a warfighter, it's because you exist to serve the rifleman. Is that there's going to be an 18-year-old jumping in a hole. And if you're a cook, if you're a pilot, if you're a JAG, if you're like anything in this organization, the reason why you're here is to support that guy. And so coming into Bitcoin, I knew that it was important. I knew I wanted to work on it. And so I knew I needed to become technical and become a coder, because insofar as we're here, it's because we're building open source software and creating environments to do that. I think you've done a lot of work with that with 1031 and just generally the podcast, right? Of like kind of putting open source developers front and center. And so working on open source and working on Bitcoin, like I just kind of did that for like a year, where I was sort of teaching Bitcoin through first through Pomp's crypto course. I was like the Bitcoin guy for it and the technical Bitcoin stuff. And then I was one of the first guys with Lisa Nygat. We did Base 58, and then I was helping her teach that for a bit. And then just kind of working in open source, eventually I come across Fedimint, and I meet Justin actually at Bitcoin Commons in Austin. And after meeting him and sort of seeing that, hey, Fedimint is actually something that's, I think, is a really interesting set of trade-offs for scaling Bitcoin in a privacy-focused way. Started working on that for about a year, and then afterwards, I joined Fedi, and so now Fedimint, the protocol, right, worked on that for about a year, and now working for Fedi, the company, which is building off of Fedimint.
I mean, that's pretty impressive to go from COVID lockdowns board, scouring Bitcoin.org, to understand Bitcoin better, to contributing to open source projects, contributing to Base 58, and now working at Fedi. How were you able to sort of scale your knowledge and your ability to participate so quickly?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. And when I talk to like newer developers, and like also, I'm very junior, right? I've been here for like 2.5 years within the Bitcoin space, right? And that's how long I've been doing development stuff for, is that the things I normally talk about are like, start building, right? And so like just pick an open source project and start contributing to it. Is that like everyone within Bitcoin is extremely welcoming and looking for new contributors. Like one of the things at Fedimint that we do really well is onboarding new contributors. And so like I did this for a while. I've kind of had to, like, it's become more intermittent, but like when I first started joining with Fedimint, I knew that there was a bunch of stuff that I have to learn, right? And so there's like a stack of white papers on my desk that apply to Fedimint, because Fedimint sort of, you get like the most difficult of everything, right? Like you do Bitcoin at the base layer, you do Lightning, you do distributed consensus, you do all sorts of fancy cryptography with blinded signatures and MUSIG and all that sort of stuff. So I had this sort of stack of white papers that I knew I needed to get through. And so what we started doing was like White Paper Wednesday, right? Where me and a bunch of other Fedimint contributors, like we would go through these things and we would be teaching each other and kind of making it more approachable so that new contributors coming onto the protocol could sort of get upskilled faster, right? And so I think that was actually, if you kind of look at the development of Fedimint, right, there was basically Eric for a little while, and then he worked on it for about a year, and then Justin comes in and a couple other contributors, and then there's sort of like this explosion after Bitcoin in Austin, and that was when it was like me, Justin, a couple other guys who were there. Like we did the first implementation of Simpimint, which was using Simplicity, Blockstream scripting language that they've been developing for Bitcoin, as a Fedimint module. And then after that, there's this big explosion out. And I think part of the reason why for that is because Fedimint became much more approachable for people to come work on, right? And so as you're like a new contributor coming to the project or anything like that, like there's a bunch of developers now who've we're very good at onboarding new guys. And so this same thing with like Core Lightning, which working with Lisa, of course, like you end up working on Core Lightning stuff a bunch, right? But I think Bitcoin generally has just gotten very, very good at taking people who are new, and if they're willing to put in work and they're willing to kind of like take on new projects, then onboarding them into the ecosystem so they can start contributing more.
Yeah, and I think what you just described is a great example of the breadth of the space. Get in, Lisa will teach you like transaction construction at Base 58. You'll learn a little bit about C Lightning, and now we have this other second layer, third layer protocol. It's actually something I'd be interested to learn. How do you refer to Fedi as a second layer or third layer? that people can then learn about and contribute to. So there's many different areas. Not everybody has to be a core developer these days. It's getting easier and easier to apply your skills at different parts of the ecosystem
Yeah.
and build apps on top of that.
Yeah, and this is something kind of going back to that philosophy I was talking about before, right? Of like every Marine and rifleman, is that one of the things I really think is coming out within Bitcoin is this sort of concept that I've been calling like every Bitcoiner a developer, right? Is that within Bitcoin, like it's like it was very surprising to me looking because like when I was working at OKX for a while, is that when you look at some of these other ecosystems, there's a lot of people working on them who don't really understand the core protocol, and a lot of people who work on them who don't really understand like the fundamental computer science behind it, right? So like they can't explain, for example, or just it's not everyone, right? But it's like if you talk to a Bitcoiner, generally he can give you a rather good explanation of some of the underlying technology, even though he might not be technical himself, right? And so I think this is coming out more and more, is that within Bitcoin, everyone's kind of building up some development chops and building up this technical background for it. And so, for example, like I think you just brought up for like Fedimint, right? So maybe we can like start talking about like the technicalities behind that. Is that for Fedi, like in terms of talking about layers 1 and 2, it kind of gets a little confusing when you talk about Fedimint that way. And the reason why is because the Fedimint eCash claims are against base layer Bitcoin, right? So I peg in or I peg out of the Federation, and when I do that, I get eCash. And so, but that's against underlying on-chain Bitcoin. And then we use Lightning gateways as an interface of trading those eCash notes between people within the Federation in order to be interoperable with the wider Bitcoin network, right? And so talking about Fedimint as layers gets a little confusing, right? Because the eCash that you're holding is a claim against the layer 1, but the interface that you're using for it is like using the Lightning gateways of layer 2, right? And so it gets a little confusing when you do that one, right?
Yeah, I guess you could call another layer 2 that's complementary to Lightning's layer 2, right? Because if you do that,
take a step for maybe we could take a sec for just sort of like the layers analogy. It comes from like sort of Bitcoin, so Bitcoin and the internet, right? Is that the internet, when we think about it in terms of layers. And part of the reason why we do that, and this is like, sorry, if you go to school for computer science, normally you end up learning about this of like the OSI model. And it's this very, I'm sure, like, if you just kind of look around on the internet, you see this stack of like, hey, there's 7 different layers, and things start up here at the application layer. They go down to the transport control protocol layer, which is TCP, and like intermediate is IP, and then it passes over to this way. And then once it's over here, it goes back up the application layer, right? And so that's sort of like the analogy that we're trying to go for within Bitcoin when we talk about layers. But this is something that like I only learned because I like kind of did a deep dive down the like original ARPANET protocols and like the sort of design philosophy that they had was that if you look at them, they're kind of like, it's kind of like Bitcoin and ETH, right? Where you had these original DARPA guys, and then the OSI were like some corporate guys who broke off from them and tried to reinvent the internet protocol. And they're the guys who came up with this stack thing that people learn about. That's not actually how the internet's run. That's how like they kind of like portray it to people. The way that it's actually run using the original DARPA layers is that there's basically 4 layers where IP is the only thing that's important for doing that connection layer between them, right? And so the whole point of internet is that it's inter-networking. And so you can have these networks where at rest, they kind of work differently between each other, but as long as they speak IP, then they can communicate across each other, right? So it's not this clean start from the top, go all the way down. Everything has to be sort of mirrored and then it goes across. It's that you can kind of think about it as more of an hourglass. And what's cool about Lightning is that Lightning is kind of becoming this IP layer for Bitcoin, right? So you see Lightning being the bridge between a bunch of different things. So there's all this new stuff about like drive chains, space chains, like different ideas for different ways where at rest at like the base layer, you can hold your Bitcoin in different ways. And then also at the application layer, having like all sorts of different interactions. But the rail between all of those, the kind of the inter-networking part of it is Lightning, right? And so that's one of the really cool things about Fedimint, where because Fedimint, like the thing that you're holding at rest are these eCash notes, but we don't expose a lot of that to the user, right? And so that's a little different than Cashew, right? Where you see the eCash notes up front. The experience that you have using Fedimint is you're just paying Lightning invoices. And on the back, you're like, basically like the thing that's happening is that you're using the eCash, and we can get into a little bit more of like the eCash and the privacy benefits, the scaling benefits, that sort of thing. But the thing that's going on in the background that you're not exposed to, like this is sort of like the man behind the curtain, is the eCash notes. but the experience that you have is just using Lightning. And so that's like, if you look at the way the internet actually works, that's kind of the same experience of that. The thing that gets exposed and the thing that kind of like connects everything is the single IP layer, right? And then like at rest, you can have different networks that kind of operate differently. If that makes sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. And that's, I think, because I went to your demo in Nashville last Friday and you explained a lot of this. And I think it'd be a good time. I mean, we've talked about Fedimints and Fedi particularly on the show a few times in the past, but I think the way you articulated it during your demo was very concise and made it very easy to understand. So just, I guess, a refresher on Fedimints, generally what Fedi does on top of Fedimint, the Fedimint protocol, and then diving into the Lightning gateways and how they work with the invoice creation and what's going on with the eCash tokens when those invoices are getting paid.
Yeah, totally. So let's kind of like build up from base principles, right? So you've got Bitcoin at the base layer. There's a block every 10 minutes. The blocks have transactions. The transactions have inputs and outputs, right? On layer 2, which is Lightning, on those base layer transactions, you have an output. And instead of just me sending it to somebody, it's me opening a channel, which is going to be a 2 of 2 multisig. So I can sling payments back and forth, right? So at the base layer, we're optimizing for security and robustness. At the Lightning layer, we're trying to optimize more toward, there's some trade-offs associated with it, but the thing we're trying to do is instant final settlement of payments, right? And so that's what you can do on Lightning that you can't do on Bitcoin. And some of the things that kind of emerge out of this is that there isn't an extremely good solution for privacy, right? So I know you've had Tony on the show, and like in Austin, like Tony talks about this stuff all the time, right? Is that like on the base layer and on Lightning, there's still significant privacy concerns, but there's also concerns for at the Lightning layer is that that's not something that scales to billions of people, right? And so while we have a really good base layer of the optimizing for the 21 million in a block every 10 minutes, while we have Lightning, which lets us do the interest, like the instant final settlement for payments, it's like we still don't have like a really good, robust, scalable custody solution that doesn't involve like a third party eventually running Lightning nodes, for example. And we also have some privacy concerns as we go up that, right? And so Fedimint, when Eric Syrian originally came up with it, was that he didn't have the Lightning component. It was just a privacy and scaling solution for Bitcoin, which was you run a Chaumian eCash mint. And so this is back in the 1980s when David Chaum comes up with his blinded signature scheme so that you can basically run a bank where there's no concept of a user, there's no concept of an account, there's just notes, there's just dollars, basically. And the dollars, it's impossible to correlate the inputs and the outputs. And so anybody who uses the bank is completely binded to the use of the users, right? And so off of that, the problem becomes, hey, well, the mint is centralized. The mint's like one guy, right? And so Fedimint is, what if we took this accounting system, this sort of bank system with blinded signatures and stuff, and we federate that mint and we put it on Bitcoin. And so the way that works is that you deposit Bitcoin, you get eCash notes that are signed by the bank. You unblind the eCash notes so that when you use the eCash notes back at the bank, they have no way of correlating the inputs and the outputs. So you achieve like great privacy. Your anonymity set is every single note of that denomination that's ever been used by the bank or the mint. Sorry, we'll use mints just to kind of clear things up. But used by the mint. But for Fedimint, we're going to take that centralized mint who's doing the signatures and we're going to federate him, right? And so now you get the privacy solution for this. But you're trying to lower the trust assumptions by federating him, right? So we can do like a 3 of 4 or a 5 of 7 or a 7 of 10 or like whatever we want to do it for, such that somebody, for example, be malicious and they could try to steal the funds, but there's nothing they can do, right? Because they would need to coordinate across the larger federation in order to do it. And so when Eric first came up with this was just a privacy and scaling solution for on-chain Bitcoin. But so he solved one problem of that, hey, what if we federate the mint? But then this is sort of like where Fedimint becomes this larger scaling solution and being able to kind of address a bunch of the concerns that now you had at Lightning, right? Is that the problem with the mint is that you're only going back and forth with the eCash to that single mint. And so it's not very useful unless everybody's in the same mint. And that becomes a problem, right? Because we don't want to have this centralized solution for it. And so what's cool about Fedimint is that we came up with this concept of gateways. And the gateway is just somebody using the mint who also runs a Lightning node. And so you pay that node in eCash, which is the claims against the Bitcoin in the mint, and then they complete the Lightning payment, or vice versa. And so now this becomes like a really good scaling solution for a community where we can show up at a community. We get 7 to 10 to however many people within that community are like technical enough that they could run a node and have a Fedimint daemon run alongside it. And then anybody in that community who's running a Lightning node can provide Lightning services for the community. And so now within the community, you've got eCash nodes going in, eCash nodes coming out, so you achieve very good privacy. You've got the eCash nodes; they're highly scalable, right? Because you have like multiple people within you. When you deposit into the mint, then you're not having like a single UTXO or multiple UTXOs for individual people, right? Like you can consolidate the reserves within the mint, and so now it becomes a scaling solution for like on-chain Bitcoin. But so you have privacy, you have scaling on the on-chain Bitcoin, and you have interoperability with the wider Lightning network by swapping eCash to Lightning. So the experience that people have of using Fedimint is that they're just paying Lightning invoices. But what's on the background is that they're settling using the eCash nodes, right? And so that's kind of like the Fedimint protocol, how that works for that one. If you got any questions or I didn't cover something specifically, like that's sort of the big overview there. And then we can talk about Fedi after.
I mean, you touched on it. I think we should elaborate on it because I think after having listened to the last session of the Lightning Summit in Nashville with Tony, Lisa, and Alex from River, is that Lightning in and of itself probably isn't like the end all be all scalable solution unless you want it to centralize amongst large third parties who can become targets to government regulation and scrutiny. And I think you said like if we want to avoid that, adding Fedimint to the mix is vital to ensure that we have sufficient distribution of Lightning nodes at that layer. Why does Fedimint help this?
Yeah, so here's a couple elements for it, right? So one is that when you're servicing a federation as a Lightning node, or you're providing Lightning services to them, is that you're basically balancing the liquidity across everybody within the federation, right? And so this is something, if you've ever run a Lightning node, is that you want to basically have your Lightning transactions represent a ton of economic activity and not just be linked to, hey, one person, like 100 channels, right? And so like we kind of get there a little bit with splicing, right? Which is pretty cool. So now, like, I don't know if you saw it recently, is that Phoenix, like they announced like their version of splicing where now as a mobile user, I have a single channel that I'm resizing with the async node, with the async node, which connects me out to the broader Lightning network. So that's like one way of kind of getting much more efficiency from Lightning. But what's cool about using Fedimint is that now you can have like these communities that are all using the Fedimint, right, in order to do the custody of the Bitcoin. And so you can balance the interaction across, maybe they have like 5 or 6 or 7 different people across a community servicing maybe like 100 or 400 people within it. And they're going through those different Lightning nodes. And because they're using the eCash for the transactions, they're achieving privacy from the Lightning nodes, privacy from the mint. And the Lightning service providers or the Lightning nodes, they really like this model because now I can have a single Lightning channel that I'm using to service maybe like 200 or 300 different people, right? And so that's why it becomes like a scaling solution for Lightning. This is something else that we've kind of like figured out of people running Lightning nodes for this stuff. The tendency is for Lightning nodes to kind of become service providers, right? And the reason why is because you need the economic incentive to run the node and to like become a good router and stuff. And the thing that you want, the ideal person on the other side of your channel is somebody who represents a ton of economic activity, right? And so that's like one of the ways that through Fedimint, you can kind of scale out that part of Lightning. But like the simple solution for scaling it out, right, is you just have everything be custodial. This is an option where there's sort of a natural limit to the size of these federations because of the trust assumption required for like, hey, there's 5 of 7 people or 6 of 10 or 7 of 10 people who are running this federation. If they're not close enough to you that you can socially sanction them, and like, NVK likes to call this proof of punch, right? Like they're close enough to me that in the event they tried to rug me, then it's like, hey, this is Bob from down the street. He's part of my community. Or this is like, like John from the VA, right? Is that they're close enough to me that I can hold them socially accountable for these things. But the guys running the Fedimint, like they're not being paid for what they're doing. The Lightning service providers who are providing services to the Fedimint, right? Those are the ones who are making routing fees, right?
Yeah, so this provides a clear economic incentive for people to spin up and maintain Lightning nodes.
Exactly, right? And an ideal partner on the other side of it, right? Because this is the issue for anybody running an LSP, right? Is like, and I know Async, for example, they're like the poster child for this, is that you spin up all these nodes, they lock up liquidity, right? And so somebody, they do a transaction into Phoenix or whatever, in order to have them receive or have like a good UX on that, you have to lock in some inbound liquidity for them as well, right? And so this is one of those ways where, well, now you just have like an individual who maybe uses Lightning Wallet like 1, 2, 3 times a day or something like that, right? Like he's locking up a ton of liquidity as it goes to that. The ideal party that you'd want on the other side is someone who represents a ton of economic energy, so is slinging payments back and forth, or is just using the channel much more, right? And so when you're a Lightning node providing Lightning gateway services for a federation, that's like an ideal partner and something that's very good for scaling out and having Lightning be like a good rail between everything. Remember that analogy we were talking about before of that Lightning becomes like the IP layer connecting these separated networks? That's sort of like the image you can have in your head of how Fedimint sort of scales this out. You've got all these different Fedimints. You've got hundreds, thousands, millions of them potentially, right? And then all connected via each other via Lightning.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, it's not the Federation members that have to run the Lightning nodes. It could be a user within the mint that's providing the service.
So maybe we can talk like specifically about what the Fedimint is doing, right? So basically, and this is why Fedimint, it starts off as just a way to custody Bitcoin, but it becomes this wider building solution for federating any application. And why Fedi, which we can move on to eventually, is Fedi is talking, the way that we like to talk about it is that it's a way to create a federated operating system for managing your money, your data, and your digital life across all of these different federations, right? And so let's kind of like take a step back of like, why do we need the federation at all? And so one of the issues, like I'm sure that you've run into this, and I'm sure everybody in Bitcoin has run into this, of that when you go from third party to first party, is that when I take self-custody, right? If I'm like technically capable of, like, absolutely we should do that, right? And this is an issue that a lot of Bitcoiners run into, is that you start thinking through the consequences of self-custody, which is that, okay, well, now it just exists on my phone or my hardware wallet or wherever it is. I need to make a backup, right? I need to make a backup such that in the event that I'm in an accident or something specifically happens to me, that I can have a recovery mechanism for it. And so kind of like the gold standard for this right now is that you want to have something like Unchained or Casa, right? Where you have a threshold multi-sig backup. So in the event that something happens to you or you lose your keys or your specific hardware wallet, you can go get a quorum of people like my wife, my mom, my lawyer, and like my friend who's also very technical or something. And they can come together and they can help me recover my funds, for example, right? And so like just kind of the little nugget that I keep in my head for this one is that any self-custody solution resilient to you being in an accident implies some sort of threshold recovery mechanism. And so that threshold recovery mechanism could just be a one of one, which is that I have a copy of my seed words on like a steel plate and my wife knows where that is and I've like hidden it somewhere or something. And the problem becomes, well, now what if I like get a divorce from my wife or something, right? Or my wife just like does something, where to own Bitcoin is to know how to spend it, right? And so the moment that she holds on to those seed words, she owns it just as much as I do, right? And so kind of the next step for that is, okay, well, what if we split that up? We can either like shard it using Shimmer secret sharing, or we can do a multi-sig or something like that. Well, now this is something that people run into when you try to do like a multi-sig solution. If you say, hey, I move this stuff into a multi-sig. Well, now in order to do any spending, I need to get signatures from everybody, right? And so people are like, okay, we'll move the cold storage funds into the multi-sig. And then we never touch the cold storage funds, right? And so what's really cool about eCash for this one, and this is like, look, first, like the federation, is that you can think about the federation as we're going to formally set up this threshold backup mechanism, which is that, I go through this process of setting up the initial guardians for this. And so this is like a threshold backup in the event that I lose my phone or in the event that I lose anything or whatever, I can recover by using this threshold backup mechanism of the federation. So that's like called social recovery, which like we put into Fedi as well. And so you have this threshold backup mechanism, but on a day-to-day basis, I'm using the eCash notes. And the eCash notes are single sig. And so you get the experience of using something like Wallet of Satoshi of just like, hey, I just scan it. It doesn't have to go talk to anybody else. It just does the eCash payment or via the Lightning Gateway, and it just gets completed. And the Lightning Gateway, because it's a larger node servicing a bunch of people, the routing is more reliable, right? So you get the experience of using a third-party custodial app, but you also get the additional privacy and you get this threshold backup mechanism out of the box, right? And so that's sort of like why we arrive back at a federation once we start thinking about like, oh, self-custody, right? But in the event like you can't self-custody, absolutely do it, right? But this is like, if we want a scaling solution, for example, that we can bring to like the global south, there's not even the infrastructure for getting them hardware wallets, for example. This is one of the things that from working at Fedi, I've kind of learned for this, so that like for me, right, I can get 5 cold cards, I can split them up, I can like get steel backups and all those kinds of things. Like if you don't even have the supply chains in place in order to reliably get someone a hardware wallet without it having being tampered with, right, you need some sort of like different solution. And Fedimint's kind of an interesting trade-offs for those solution sets, right? And so that's kind of that covers the federation side of things. And so we can kind of move on to the other stuff later, but like if you got any questions there, like I think I covered a lot. So
No, and I like how you guys classify it as second party custody. It's in the middle of that spectrum between first party full Bitcoin and cold storage and third party full. You just completely rely on an exchange or a custodial wallet like Wallet of Satoshi. And it is a bit controversial. Like there's definitely the hardcore hold UTXOs on chain in a wallet that you control or run your own Lightning node, or you actually don't own Bitcoin. But if we're being honest with ourselves, like it's not going to be possible to scale Bitcoin at the base layer to billions of people. There simply will not be enough UTXOs. You cannot create an individual UTXO for every human, even a billion humans, if you wanted to, not even the whole world, just a small percentage of it. Which then leads people to the question of, well, maybe Bitcoin's not for everybody. Maybe it's for the hardcore people who just want to do stuff out of the purview of the state. But I'm not under the impression that that's where we're going with this. I do think everybody should have access to Bitcoin and the value it provides. And we do have to weigh those trade-offs and sort of find out where that happy medium is. And I think the Fedimint and Fedi solution is a very creative way to solve the scaling problem. Because again, if we want to get as many people as possible access to the best money on earth, there are going to be some trade-offs made along the way. And it's just evaluating those trade-offs and making sure you don't go too far in one direction.
Yeah. And that's something that's like a real motivating factor behind a lot of the work that we do at Fedi, right? Which is that for like that initial reaction that you get where people say, oh, hey, well, maybe Bitcoin can only be for like a couple people or something, right? Well, it's kind of hard to do that. It's kind of hard to have the conversation with somebody. Like, for example, one of the things that I did after I finished up my active duty time, I got reactivated as a reservist to go help resettle Afghan refugees after the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? And one of the things over there, that's something that really taught me that like, hey, Bitcoin is something that people need, not just something that like certain privileged people want, for example, right? And so like when I was there, one of the really valuable things I was able to do was help teach them how to use stuff like, because like OKCoin was still operating in both Afghanistan and the US. So after they closed off TransferWise, they closed off Western Union, they closed off everything. The State Department like shut down all fiat flows from the United States into Afghanistan, like in its entirety. Like the only way to get money in there was using some sort of permissionless protocol. So like Bitcoin, they would go over there, and then normally they would end up swapping into a stablecoin or something, and just figuring out a solution in Afghanistan for just getting money to people, right? Because like they need to like pay in order to get people to airports. They need to pay in order to like pass checkpoints and those kinds of things. Like, you know, it was a huge wake up experience for me where, you know, if the answer can't be, hey, we're really sorry, but we've got this amazing money, but we just can't fix it in such a way that you can use it, right? Like when we're talking to somebody who's living under like 30% inflation or 70% inflation, or who's like governments are like stopping them from, you know, just like living their life generally, right? Like we need to build out tooling so that we can scale this out to everybody else. And I think Fedimint is like a really interesting trade-off space, just like you said, between first party and third party custody, where we can create a scaling solution, a privacy solution that allows us to bring Bitcoin to a bunch more people than if we were just using like base layer Bitcoin or Lightnings on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, again, the trade-off is you're getting access to Bitcoin, but you're trusting a federation of individuals or companies, maybe institutions, whatever it may be. We're not exactly sure how this will progress. I could see it going down a number of different paths. And yep. I guess that's just being aware of how the federation could rug you and
Well, that I think
alongside
kind of
that.
leads us into Fedi, right? And so for Fedi, we're calling it a federated operating system. But the idea behind Fedi is that you have a front end application that on the back end is coordinating all of your data, your money, digital life across these different federations. So the world that we see is that you're going to have many different ones of these federations because, like you said, there is this trade off of yes, you are trusting the federation, right? But we already have existing communities that are high trust or that it depends on how you define your community. You can define it as your local community. You can define it as your larger diaspora. You can define it as like social groups. Like I know you had Balaji on the podcast recently. You can kind of think about it in terms of the network state and the different scales that you grow out to there, right? And with Fedimint, basically you give them this out of the box solution where you can take the existing community and you can equip them with really good Bitcoin, Lightning, privacy technology, right? And this is like where we kind of get beyond, because what Fedimint started as was just a scaling solution for Bitcoin and eventually Lightning, right? And a privacy solution. But when you think about it conceptually, is what does it mean to own Bitcoin? It means to own and manage the data associated with able to spend that Bitcoin, right? And so basically managing secrets. And so what you can do is, because originally when we built Fedimint, Fedimint's all written in Rust. It's like a very complex code base. Just in order to organize it kind of for ourselves, and like Eric and DPC, who both Fedimint contributors, like major Fedimint contributors, they kind of took the lead on this, of that splitting it up into this module system. And so the initial modules that you get out of the box with Fedimint, we call them the default modules, are Bitcoin, Lightning, eCash. And so the federation is just running this distributed consensus, and you're plugging in these modular capabilities to it. And so the same way in Bitcoin, we have inputs and outputs. In Fedimint, you have a distributed consensus, just like Bitcoin, where they have different, we're moving away from this, but for using a different distributed consensus mechanism. But the way to think about it is we call them epochs, right? And epochs contain transactions. The transactions have inputs and outputs. And you as a developer can define those inputs and outputs. And so, for example, the normal transaction when you peg in, is the input is Bitcoin, the output is eCash. When you're doing a payment, then the input is eCash, the output is some like an advertisement to anyone in the federation who, if I'm running a Lightning node, I can complete this payment in exchange for this Lightning payment in exchange for eCash. When we built that Simpimint module, which was simplicity, which again is the scripting language that Blockstream's been developing, which is going to hopefully be forking into Bitcoin so that we can use much more advanced base layer scripting, is that the input for that was eCash and the output was execution of a smart contract as defined in simplicity. And so you start building with this Fedimint module system. Well, you can build out a module for basically any application that you'd like to run in a federated manner. And so one of those might be something like a password manager. And so you get an out of the box federated backup of all of your locally run passwords. And so now you don't run into a LastPass situation, right? Because all of your data is run within people that you trust, which is your local community. It never goes outside of that third party. Or something else, you could do a stability pool, which is another module that's been developed for Fedimint, where because you have this larger pool of liquidity, you can do stuff like synthetic dollar trading strategies. And so you can lock in the price of Bitcoin to $1. It becomes this sort of really modular platform for building out federated applications. And Fedi is the front end application for interacting between all of these different federations. So maybe you've got one at the VA level, I don't know, I just think about them for the federations that I'll be setting up probably, right? With other people is at the VA level, at a state level or a city level, my local federation that's just people within my local area, or then maybe a larger Bitcoiner federation or something. Is that Fedi is sort of the front end for interacting across all of those. How do I manage all of my life and my data and my money across these things? So for example, if I have too much in a larger federation where they're kind of further away from me, well, maybe I can immediately sweep that into my local federation. And then from there, immediately sweep that to cold storage if I wanted to, or something like that. Right. But it becomes this really cool way where we're thinking about, hey, I only have to expose as part of my identity those parts of my identity that I want to be exposed as part of this community that I'm within, right? And so I can use money, which is Bitcoin, right? And I can use my data, which is managed across these different federations, right? To make sure that I'm only exposing those parts of my identity that I want to be exposed in those ones. I don't have to tell them everything about myself in order to just be part of a community.
Yeah, the modularity of what you guys are building at Fedi is extremely exciting, and I don't think anybody listening to this can really grok it until you see it. Last Friday during your demo, we went from the Fedi Alpha Fedimint to the AI for all Fedimint, and it's really crazy when you join a new Fedimint. Like they have a suite of apps that are specific to that mint. Like
Yeah.
Fedi Alpha is pretty vanilla. You can find out where people are accepting Bitcoin as payment, do a couple other things. And then you get into the AI for all Fedimint, and they have stack work, which makes sense for them because they're doing AI hackathon and they want to leverage stack work to help out there. You have LN chat, which I'm sure we'll talk about
Mhm.
in a bit here. But like that was the first time I joined another mint outside of the Fedimint Alpha, or the Fedi Alpha, excuse me. And it was like, whoa, like this is really personalized.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things for basically what we've been talking about is like the Fedimint protocol layer of that at the protocol, when you initially set up the federation, you can configure it with certain modules. So for example, if you want people who use the mint to be able to lock in a dollar price of their Bitcoin, they could be running the stability pools module, right? If you want them to be able to have like a threshold backup mechanism, so this hasn't been built out yet, but if you're a Rust developer out there and you'd like to give this a shot, like we're doing a hackathon this month, and so this would be like a cool submission for it, would be like a password manager, right? Where the threshold backup of all the passwords is managed across the different federations, right? And so for each federation, you can configure like at the protocol layer, like what you're running. So what like the Fedimint transactions are going to look like, right? But on the Fedi side, what we also allow you to do is like we've got kind of three phases that we're going to be rolling this out in. Is that the first phase is just like WebLN interactions, right? And so you can take a website and you can run it inside of Fedi. And so when you're running it inside Fedi, then it gets direct access to like the Lightning wallet. Well, it's not the Lightning wallet, right? But it's like the eCash paid over Lightning. And so you can do something like run stack work, or you can run Stacker News, or you can run like, a Nostr client or something like Primal, right? And you can have the experience of that's very clean because it's able to directly talk to Fedi, right? So that's what it kind of starts off that way. And that's what just like in the initial alpha release that we've developed out for, of that you can make like really clean WebLN applications that play with Fedi very well. Right. And then phase two of that is going to be, okay, well, now I have this federation aspect of it. Anything that you want to pool community resource wise, like for example, if you in a community have like a couple people who have access to graphics cards or something, and you want to pool access to that and make like a tiny little graphics card farm and like gate access to it, that's something that works really well in a federated context, building on top of Fedimint as a module. And so the phase two is going to be, okay, well, now the federations and the different Fedimints, they're going to be able to host different applications and stuff on behalf of their communities, right? So maybe they host like a Nostr relay that's like extremely well run, and they can manage access to it based on Lightning payments or like membership in the federation or something like that. They can manage like encrypted chat applications and stuff. They can do anything like that. You can host it at the federation level. And then phase three for Fedi mods is going to be, okay, well, now I've got the WebLN application running inside Fedi. I've got these resources on the back end, and I've got the Fedimint protocol underneath it that's got running these different modules. Well, how do we pipe through and allow somebody using Fedi to be able to access the resources of the federation and the different Fedimint protocol configurations through modules that they've done, and expose those to the application, right? And so if I'm running on like a WebLN site, for example, I go on a website, I could have like a chat bot. This is just like an example for this. If you want to build this out, like, please like submit to the hackathon or just contact me, like happy to work on this with you, right? Maybe they have like an AI chatbot that is running against graphics cards locally in their federation. And so every time they want to interact with a website on the AI side of things, so just open up a chatbot that can expose it, but they don't want to like have their data get passed over to a third party like OpenAI, then they can have that pass back, run at the federation level, but maybe they're running the new Lob 2 that just came out today, right? Like a 70 billion parameter. You need like big beefy graphics cards to run that, right? So you can have anybody in the anybody using Fedi as part of that federation, they can like pipe that back in, run it at the federation level, and pipe it back out. And so it's kind of like very ambitious. Like we're moving toward that. Right now, it's more just the WebLN side of things, but like very soon, after the mainnet releases and stuff, we're going to be trying to build out allow the Fedimints to also be hosting resources for the Fedi mods, and then also having the Fedi mods be able to directly access those resources via Fedi. Right. I think you're on mute, Marty.
Was on mute there. I mean, you said it's early days and you got big ambitious goals, but I mean, it's just the Stacker News example, like in the Fedi for all Fedimint, I jumped in there and used WebLN to sign in, and then boosted a post or upvoted a post, and that was a beautiful thing. The first time on iOS for me doing a Lightning payment on a site like Stacker News, I didn't have to leave the app. It literally just popped up. It was like, pay now, done.
Yep.
And just that UX improvement alone is massive for making the barriers to entry much lower for people.
Totally.
Yeah. In the before we jump into AI, because that's actually why I hit you up. It's like, I need to talk about Bitcoin and AI. You're on the cutting edge, I would say. But just to wrap up, like the trade-offs with the federated model and diving into the individual guardians, the federation members. I mean, I did ask this question on the panel after your demo last week, which is, what are the hardware requirements for an individual guardian? And it's if they're running an Umbrella, a Start9, whatever it may be, you just have Bitcoin Core downloaded, and you download Fedimint right alongside it, and boom, you can be a guardian within a federation. The follow-up question I wasn't able to ask, but wanted to ask you now is, what are the liveliness requirements for each individual guardian? Like, say one of their servers goes down temporarily, what's the process for that to get back in the swing of signing these token transactions?
So this is a Bitcoiner podcast, so I can talk a little bit technically about this, right? Which is the ideal configuration that you want to have when you're setting up these Fedimints is you want it to be Byzantine fault tolerant, right? And so that's like fancy computer science. Byzantine fault tolerance is when you're talking about a distributed system, it's very hard to distinguish between somebody who's lying to you and somebody who's actively being malicious, or somebody who just hasn't been connected, right? And so in terms of, there's like certain distributed consensus protocols that require you to be online continuously, right? So if anybody drops out, then like everything stops, and like you have to do this whole restart mechanism. And like sometimes you can't even restart depending on the different protocol that you're using, right? So the thing that we're using is we're using an asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant consensus mechanism. And so what does that mean? It means that different Federation guardians can go offline, and if they go offline, as long as they're above, like the number is 3M plus 1, where M is the number of malicious peers. So if you have a 3 of 4, then that's M of 1. And so one person can go offline or be actively malicious trying to steal the funds, and there's nothing that they can do. Is that the protocol will just continue because you have the 3 signers who are able to continue going, right? If you have a federation of like 5 of 7, then 2 people could be actively malicious and trying to steal the funds, or just go offline completely, and there's nothing that they'd be able to do. And so now it's like, okay, well, what if 2 people, if you have like a 3 of 4, and what if 2 people become actively malicious or something? Is that the specific one that we're using right now is called HBBFT, which is Honey Badger Byzantine Fault Tolerance, which is like, you know, like little Bitcoin joke about it, right? And the one that we're moving to, there's a different one that we're moving to called Aleph, right? But one of the properties of both of these is that in the event that you've got less than 2/3 of the guardians who go offline or are actively malicious, the protocol just stops. And so because you can't get the 3 of 4 or the 5 of 7, because you've got additional people who are malicious, you can't sign additional transactions in order to continue with the protocol, but they can't steal the funds. Is that you're just stuck there. Is that, so for example, if we're doing a 3 of 4 federation and one person goes offline, then nothing, like the user experience is nobody notices that, right? But like, you know, on the Fedi side, we'll probably do like a notification that it's like, hey, you've got a guardian who's been off for a while or something like that. Maybe you want to sweep your funds to a different Fedimint or something. And then, but if 2 people go offline, so you've got 2 of the 4 who are offline or actively trying to be malicious and rug or whatever, like they can't do anything. And the reason why is because it requires 3 of 4 in order to do anything with the protocol. And if you don't get 3 of 4, it just basically stops where it is. And once you get 3 of 4, it continues. Right. And so that's like a little bit technical on those things, but I think we covered each of those, right? Is that if you've got 1/3, up to 1/3 of people can be malicious, and they could be like actively malicious guardians or something, like, you know, one of the guardians is, or just goes offline, because in a distributed consensus system, it's very difficult to distinguish between people who are actively trying to be malicious and people who are just offline. And so the way that you solve for that is you build a protocol that doesn't distinguish between those, right? Is that we treat you, if you're offline, as being malicious, and we solve for it anyway, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because my assumption is that a lot of guardians are just going to have problems every now and then with their servers. Like I've seen this with our Lightning node at TFTC. It goes down every once in a while if our disk requirements aren't up to snuff. We have to upload the amount of data we're buying from our cloud provider. And
well, so the process of running a Guardian node, right, is that if you're running the Fedimint daemon, you just run it alongside a Bitcoin node. Like a Bitcoin node, you don't have to have a Lightning node for it. Remember, the Guardians are just running Bitcoin. And so you have a Bitcoin node, you just run the Fedimint daemon alongside it, and you just keep it watered with electricity and hard drive space, and you don't have to touch it. And that it just sits there and it's just running this distributed consensus with everybody else, right? And so this is another benefit of it, right, is that because we have this distinction between the Guardian nodes and the Lightning nodes, because Lightning nodes are extremely sort of like intensive to like go back and forth with this. Like I think Callie just a couple of days said like, something that people don't really talk about is the PTSD associated with running a large Lightning node is that it's very hard to do and very hard to do effectively, right? And so like, yeah, there's like some of these solutions that are coming out, which are like Breeze and like Phoenix or whatever that like make it a little easier, but kind of like abstract that away a little bit, right? But just generally speaking, it's very hard because Lightning, you have to be live all the time, right? And so what's nice about Bitcoin core nodes, right, normally, and this is why people can just kind of like have them run and sit in the background, right, is that it doesn't really require you to interact with it. Fedimint would just be something you run alongside your Bitcoin node, and you can just like have it sit there. And you don't have to touch it. You don't have to be doing anything crazy about it. Just keep it, make sure that the electricity is still running, that you have enough hard drive space, and it's not too much additional hard drive space versus just running a Bitcoin core node.
Yeah, I'm really excited for what Breeze is doing. Things like Blockstreams, Greenlight, VLS, like those solutions that separate the private keys from the node and allow you to run the private key in one piece of hardware that can always be on and just allocate everything else to the cloud on the node side of things. I think that's going to be massive for usability. I could be wrong, but that's just my assumption.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen it, right? And just in terms of like kind of doing Lightning stuff for the last 2 or so years, right? Is that the ease of use of doing this stuff? I mean, like the Breeze SDK is really beautiful in terms of making like a good developer experience for like running a Lightning node for this stuff. But like this is also just another issue that we have, and this is why we talk about this like kind of spectrum of first to third party custody, where there's this big spectrum in the middle of second party custody, right? Is that there's an interesting set of trade-offs within there that we're exploring, right? Which is that, and like even within like running Lightning nodes, right? Like you can be like very close to the metal. You can also be, okay, well, Phoenix is running on my node on my phone, right? And like I don't really have to interact with it or touch it in any way, right? There's kind of spectrum between those. Is that you can use that same spectrum when you're developing different Lightning applications, right? So for example, one of the like easiest ways to get started building Lightning applications, if you're just a front-end developer, is using Lightning addresses, where you don't have to manage any of the node stuff. You don't have to touch any of the node stuff. You just do normal HTTP requests. And like on the back end, like there's a Lightning address server, which is serving this stuff up, right? So I found that a super effective way for getting new devs to start building on Bitcoin is just using Lightning addresses. And then once they realize, oh, hey, I'm actually making a bunch of money in terms of doing the Lightning address stuff. Sorry, I'm just letting my dog in. Once I start realizing I'm getting a bunch of money, well, okay, well, now I'm trusting the Lightning service provider who's running the Lightning address server. So maybe I want to move to doing my own node, and I can kind of move that way. And it's the same sort of thing with Fedimint, right? Where maybe you start with a very close to you federation. Maybe you like join some like further away federations. The money and data that you have associated with that larger federation is like, okay, this is getting a little bit too far away from me. Maybe I'm like not as close with those guardians anymore. So that you can roll it back to something closer to yourself, or you can, so you move it back to something closer to yourself, or you can sweep it into cold storage or like first party custody, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think having that optionality is very important, and at the speed of Lightning as well, because like equating it to something like a Binance where you have that full custodial relationship, and at some point they thrust KYC on you, and if you don't fill it out, you're not going to get your Bitcoin.
Yeah.
The Federation at the speed of Lightning, if you begin to worry that that's going to happen with your guardians, you just get it off right away. And then since they don't know who you are individually, it's much harder to do all that.
Yeah. And for that privacy aspect for it, right? Like let's talk about that for a second. Of that, when I'm talking about like some third party over there who doesn't know me, who doesn't know my family, who doesn't like not very close to me, in terms of the private, there's different privacy trade-offs associated with it, where like I'm not very concerned that they like see some of my like personal interactions and those kinds of things. Like I'm not like the most, like generally speaking, when people are using people are using money and using credit cards and stuff, is that they're not as concerned that like, hey, some random person may or may not be able to. Sorry, my dog is digging. May
Is that
or
a
may
good
not
boy in the background?
my transactions. Like, but once you're talking about like, hey, very, very close to me, like this is Bob down the street. This is like a community leader. This is somebody who's like very, very close to me, like my wife even, right? Is that you need to have that baseline of privacy, right? Of that, like, or maybe I'm like living in a government where under a government that doesn't like approve of what I'm doing. If you're running these local federations with second party custody, you need to kind of start from the building off of like, hey, you have really good privacy. And then after that, like maybe you can make an opt-in module. Like this is something that's a couple of people have been working on, is like making an accounts module, for example. So you want to do something like, if you want to run like the EVM as part of the contracting system for Fedimint, then like you need some like account model for it. And so an accounts have persistent identity. You don't have as good privacy associated with it. But the default out of the box options for Fedimint are that you achieve very, very good privacy, right? And that's because you're running in these local communities, so you want to be able to opt into it. It's kind of like the cypherpunk ethos, right? Of that, like, privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is the ability to selectively reveal yourself as part of a transaction. And that's sort of like the design decisions associated with Fedimint, of that, like, out of the box, it's that, hey, we're using the eCash system, we're using Lightning, we're using Bitcoin, right? But then you can add additional modules and configurations for, say you want to have like a persistent identity, like you wanted to do something like Lightning addresses. So we're actually coming up with some pretty cool solutions for doing Lightning addresses, but maintain your privacy. But like if you wanted to do a Lightning address normally, you'd have to have a persistent identity for something like that, right? Because it's, I'm Marty at getalby.com or something, right?
That is my Lightning address if you guys want to send me some sats.
Okay.
But yeah, that's one of my Lightning addresses. What do you think the first killer module or killer app or use case of Fedimints or within Fedi particularly is going to be?
I've been extremely bullish on synthetic dollar trading strategies. And so this was actually back when I was at OKX. So I was like originally just that was like my first software engineering job. And so, but like while I was there, I was like running these like weekly sessions on like, this is how Bitcoin works. This is why it's important. This is why like Bitcoin, not some of these other coins, right? And so one of the things that while I was there was they had the collapse of all the banks, like the crypto banks. Remember that? We had like Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Bank, and Signature Bank. Like they all collapsed within like a week of each other or so. And like in the days before that, in the weeks before that, I had been like, hey, this is not a question of going from like one bank to another. This becomes a question of what if there are no banks? What if we can't get a banking license at all? Right. And I think that a lot of people are running into these issues. And so one of the really interesting solutions for that is using synthetic dollars. And so the way that works is basically I take my Bitcoin and I deposit and I like hold my Bitcoin here. I take some percentage of it and open up a short position against that Bitcoin. And so now the price of if the price of Bitcoin goes up, then some of the Bitcoin that I'm holding goes up, but the short price, the position that I'm holding as the short goes down. And the net between those is a stable US dollar price, right? And so this is a way that you can do without having to touch a bank, because all you need is Bitcoin and a place to trade it. You can lock in the price of Bitcoin to dollars. So for example, this is what Galloway is doing in order to give US dollar accounts to everybody who uses Galloway, right, on the Blink wallet. Is that because it's a custodial solution on that one, and they have a sufficient liquidity associated with it, they can do these hedging strategies in order to create synthetic dollars. So that they don't actually touch banks at any level of the stack. They're just shorting Bitcoin on an exchange using perpetual inverse swap contracts, and they're going long. So maybe I have like 1 million sats or something. I take like 600,000 of those, and then I keep them like segregated off, and then 400,000 go to the exchange or the DeFi pool or whatever it is that I'm using to short the instrument. And so I open the short position and say like the price of Bitcoin goes up. Well, then the price of my sats goes up. That's over here. But when I close the position on the exchange and I get it back, instead of the 400,000 sats, now I have like 200,000 sats or whatever, right? And so I haven't been exposed to the price volatility of Bitcoin. The net between those two is always a stable US dollar price. But in order to do that, you need sufficient liquidity, because like in order to get like good order book depth, you need sort of like larger than like in order to not get like killed while you're doing these trades, in order to like hedge out the position properly. And so what's cool about Fedimint is that we've got this stability pools module that like federations, that it's not one of the default modules, but it's something that federations might be able to run. Is that now because you have additional liquidity and you have additional depth, you can basically create an API for locking in the price of it, because you can have liquidity providers for the Federation who are like, hey, I want to short Bitcoin, or I want to go long Bitcoin, or whatever it is. And like they can be the other side of that trade in order for people in the Federation lock in their price of Bitcoin. So the experience they have is just using dollars. Like the thing that shows up in their app while they're going back and forth is like $1 price, but they can still scan Lightning invoices. They still get the advantages of the eCash claims and those sorts of things, right? So I think that's like a huge unlock for that, because something that I've seen personally is that like the price volatility of Bitcoin is a huge deterrent for a lot of people who otherwise would join in, right? Like they want the rails of using Bitcoin. They want the instant finally settled micropayment over Lightning. They want to be able to like, like I know that you were talking about this. I actually started this. I haven't finished it up yet because I was a little bit busy this morning, but making like basically do a Lightning payment and then get like a Stable Diffusion 2.0 generation or something that costs 0.1 cents, but you can pass that cost along in sats. They want that experience, but they don't want to have to be exposed to the price volatility of Bitcoin. Right. And it's not something, if you're like in the global South and like your net take home at the end of the week is like $50 or something, like you can't be exposed to a 25% price swing, for example. And so I think that adding in those stability pool module, where even if you're in a place that doesn't have a banking relationship, you can set up one of these federations, and then on the people within the federation, they can lock in the price of Bitcoin to dollars. So that gives them a really cool strategy for, now I get the permissionlessness and advantages of Bitcoin, but I don't have to be exposed to the price volatility associated with it. I think that's like a huge unlock.
I completely agree. I could see that being the first killer use case. Not to answer my own question, but no, Peter McCormick was tweeting about it the other day. Like, I had to pay somebody in Argentina and they asked me for stable coins over Bitcoin. Like, there's obviously a use case over here for this. It was running over Ethereum. Like, are we doing enough in Bitcoin? And again, I think there's, in order of operations to all this, we will get to that point where you can exchange stable value using the Bitcoin rails. It just took some time to get things settled at the protocol layer to enable Lightning and get Lightning mature, and then have Eric and a bunch of others come up with this idea, or really Eric come up with this idea of Fedimints, leveraging Lightning, and then bam, we can do it. Like, Stability Pools won that hackathon in the fall, correct?
Yeah, that was before I came on at Fedi. That was a hackathon. I think it was January-ish, right? But they were the ones that built that one. And the Stability Pool, you can kind of think about it as like a DeFi pool, right? But like without all of the problems associated with doing that, where you try to support like all of these crazy multiple currencies and have like all of these weird issues associated with the liquidity providers, right? Is that it's just a very clean interface of the reason why this thing exists. The exclusive thing for this module is that you have people on one side of the trade who are trying to lock in their price of Bitcoin, and people on the other who need liquidity provisions in order to like put on a long or short position or whatever, right? It's like a very limited set for that. But because you're just limiting that set out of it, and because you have the additional liquidity of the federation versus like an individual, where normally like the batch sizes for these hedging positions, there's normally updates of like $100 ish, right? Is that in order to like make this thing work, you need the additional liquidity and depth of an order book of a larger group, right? And so the federation becomes like a good intermediate layer between, hey, you don't have like this third party who's like, like Kraken or something like that, right? Where, but it's not like an individual. And so in that intermediate layer, you can still get the good execution costs in order to make it so that you're not like losing your shirt on all of the trade costs associated with doing the hedging.
Yeah, and then liquidity providers are incentivized to provide that liquidity because they're going to make some money on the fees for holding that liquidity in there. And and another thing too, like you can abstract all that, like perp swap, taking a short position away, where it's like, hey, how much Bitcoin do you want to lock up at? How much USD do you want?
It's super simple, right? And this is one of the really cool things. I actually did some initial work on this. I haven't gotten time to finish it up, but of taking stable sats as it exists in Galloy, and it's just an open source Rust implementation of that, taking that and turning that into a Fedimint module, right? So that you could literally, if you wanted to, then the strategy for doing the liquidity provision for it is that you could use a third-party exchange if you wanted to. And this is something like, it'd be better to use stability pools where you're just doing it locally within the federation. But like the whole point of Fedimint is that it's an opt-in system, right? So like out of the box, you get really good privacy, you get Bitcoin, you get on-chain, you get eCash, right? But you can opt in using these modules to additional stuff. Like maybe I want to have an account system. Maybe I want to use an EVM as the smart contracting system. Maybe I want to like run simplicity, right? Or maybe I want to have like space chains or something like this. Like what's really great about this is you can just take any application that you could run in this federated context because you already have the Fedimint system set up there where they're running a distributed consensus. You've got access to Bitcoin, you've got interoperability with Lightning, you've got the eCash abstraction in order to do sort of like the bearer instruments of moving between different modules and between different inputs and outputs on the transactions. And so it becomes this really, really cool layer for you can just opt into these different layers of for this one, I want to maybe we could start moving on to AI with this stuff. Is that one of the cool applications I really think is going to be another really cool one for Fedimint is going to be hosted access to GPUs, right? And so for a lot of these communities that we're thinking of launching in, you don't have a bunch of individuals who have graphics cards themselves or the ability to access graphics cards at a cloud level, right? So one of the issues that this is what kind of prompted me to start going further down the AI side is that they really have serious monetization problems. And the reason why is because I show up at your website, I hit a GPT-4 call that costs 2 to 7 cents. Right. And so the cost is going to go down, but the quality of the models is going to go up. And so whenever you want to get access to the most recent stuff, most cutting edge stuff, it's going to be a couple cents or a couple fractions of a cent or something. It's not something that you can just amortize out your cost because it's basically free. Right. Which is what kind of the previous computing paradigm that we were in with I don't like the Web 2, Web 3 thing, right? But Web 2 is that, it doesn't cost Facebook much to just have me show up at the Facebook website a bunch. But if I showed up at Facebook and the first thing that happens is I do an interaction with their new Llama 2 model, right? Replicate, which is one of the companies that's exposing APIs to a lot of these things, they don't even let you hit the 70 billion parameter one, which is the biggest, most performant version of the model. And the reason why I think is because it's too expensive and they can't just let people hit against that. And even if you wanted to pay for it, the mechanism they currently use for paying for it is credit cards. And so that limits the number of people that you can have access to, and it requires them to dox themselves, to give their information, to give all their credit card stuff. They have to work through Stripe. It's this whole thing, right? And so what I really think is going to be cool is Fedimints running basically hosted access to graphics cards for people within their community so that you can run something locally that you can't just run on your phone, right? But you don't have to reach out to a third party in order to do the execution for it.
Yeah, I mean, you provided the jumping off point for the AI discussion. But before, because I do have some questions around that particular use case specifically. It's will you be getting access to the best AI products in that model? And before you answer that, maybe we just pretend like I'm the idiot I am, don't know anything about AI. What is the AI landscape? I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard about LLMs, generative AI, the compute necessary to make it all work, AI agents, what's the base of artificial intelligence and the industry growing around it, and the iterative process getting built on top of it?
Yeah, sure. So let's kind of do a brief overview of why this stuff has exploded recently, right? Is that the specific things that we've been kind of working on and that have sort of been developing are these large language models. And so basically a language model uses, let's make it even more simple, right? Is that basically with large language models, what you're doing is you're basically training it over a giant data set, which is think about the entire compendium of human knowledge. And we're just taking all of that and we're just saying, okay, based off of everything that has ever been written, which is the data sets associated with doing this are scrapes of the entire internet, giant code bases, I think for Microsoft's models and OpenAI's models, they use the entirety of GitHub, for example, right? All the open source stuff available there for not only the language models, but for the diffusion models, they're training them on billions and billions and billions of different pictures, right? And images and videos. And so you're just taking all of this stuff and then you're saying, okay, based off of everything that I have there, I can predict what the next letters are going to be in the input that you're giving me. And so this is something where if you've been playing with ChatGPT or any of these chat interfaces for this stuff, the big thing for this was now you have these new chat models, which are trained over instruct data sets. And so what does that mean? Is that normally what the language model is doing is it's just predicting what the next token is. And based off of the entire corpus of history, the next token is probably just a continuation of the sentence or a continuation of the paragraph, right? Is that the interface of chat has been super useful because the way that they model the data sets for it and they specifically fine tune it over it, which is basically you take the larger corpus of information and you say, hey, specifically, I want you to have a higher probability associated with answering in these ways, right? Which is the smaller data set, that's more refined data set that I'm training you over, an instruct data set, where it's more question and answers, is that instead of like, I post a question and based off the entire compendium of human history, it's just asks more questions. It's I pose a question and it can give me an answer, right? And so that interface has been extremely useful and extremely intuitive. And this is kind of the first time that users has been able to see, like, just for themselves, that like this stuff is really useful and powerful and I can do a lot of stuff, right? So like everybody's had like probably a couple like weird experiences with ChatGPT, but also some great experiences, right? Of like, these are things that I didn't think it would be able to do. And so that's like sort of on the large language model side. And so one of the really cool things about this is that you get access to intelligence, access to like, I can, instead of having to do like search and I've got like the 10 blue links or whatever, I can just ask a question and get an answer. And like, you have this problem of hallucination. And the reason why you have these hallucination problems is because the model itself is just saying, based off the entire compendium of human knowledge and the fine tuning parameters that you put into here, I predict the next couple letters to be this. And then I predict it to be this. And then I predict it to be this. So when it's hallucinating, it doesn't like have complete context of everything that's going on inside of that sentence. It's just predicting what the next token is, right? And so this is kind of like a bunch of different stuff. But in order to run these models and have access to them, these are very expensive. And you think about every single time that you hit against ChatGPT or every single time that you hit against Stable Diffusion or anything like this. Stable Diffusion is like an image model, a text to image model, or like any of these other stuff, right? They've got like the Whisper models where you can take audio and turn it into text. All of these things is basically every single time you're doing that, you're setting a graphics card on fire, right? And so that is expensive and that's costly. And so like there was a period when ChatGPT first came out where everybody was using it, where OpenAI was burning millions and millions of dollars a day. And the reason why was because, hey, we want to give people an access to this stuff and we want to see it and get the initial response for it, but you run into these issues. And so one of the big issues in this last couple of weeks has been that the quality of ChatGPT for the GPT-4 models has gone down enormously. And you see like, hey, it's faster, but all of the like things that I really like it for, of that it was able to do all these amazing things, like now the quality of the answers is going down significantly. Well, why is that? Well, it's because they're basically cutting back on their burn. That's what I think is going on. And so this is extremely expensive. The whole model of, oh, hey, I've got 10% of my users who are going to pay for the 90% who don't pay at all doesn't work, where every single time somebody shows up my website, they cost between like 5 and 20 cents, right? So this is why I was so excited about Lightning, because a lot of the stuff we've been building in Lightning is this instant finally settled micropayments. Specifically, some of the stuff that I was working on, and like this is sort of the space that I've been spending a lot of time in, is over the web. And so basically you hit an API, the API returns a 402 payment required code, and you complete the invoice and then complete the call, right? Is that this is the first place where, okay, well, API calls beforehand basically were free. And so when we said like, oh, hey, you can monetize an API call, you can have someone cost like 1 cent to show up at your website. That wasn't a very appealing thing to tell people, because they were like, hey, my API basically cost nothing, right? Like this is not like a big expense for me. But now it's becoming this huge expense. And there is no better solution than the Lightning Network. And specifically just doing this, hey, I hit against the endpoint, it gives me back a payment required code. I pay the invoice, and now I can continue interactions with the website as my authorization code. There is no better solution than Lightning in terms of the speed and in terms of the final settlement of the bearer instrument. And that's like another kind of side thing for this of why AI is like such a good opportunity for monetization on the Bitcoin side, is because the issue a lot of these guys are running into is that they're using credit cards. And so if somebody shows up on my website, it costs me 4 cents, right? And then they swipe their credit card, and then, okay, well, the minimum transaction I can do is $2. And so now I can't just like open up this. I have to have them get credits. I have to like do this whole thing. I have to get their information. I have to get, so that in the event that they do a chargeback, I can like contact them and all those sorts of things. It's this whole mess, right? But with Lightning, when you do a Lightning payment, you as the sender achieve very good privacy. So I, as a developer, can make a Lightning gated website, and then users can show up and I don't have to know anything about them except for the fact that they paid me. And I can pass along the costs to the user as they're using my website. And so this is like a really cool use case for Lightning, where for a lot of the other stuff that we've been doing, it's like, yeah, sure, I could do this with Lightning, but I can also do it with dollars, and there's a whole infrastructure for dollars and all that sort of thing, right? Is that I think we first started seeing it with Nostr, where it's Zaps, where like you really can't do that with like the fiat system. This is another example of this, where there is no mechanism to do this with fiat. You're not going to be able to pass the cost along to the users in that way. The only way that everyone's doing it right now is basically with credit cards. And that becomes huge issues. Like one of the things I made was basically wrapper around ChatGPT that you can pay with Lightning for. And like the initial contacts that I got about it were like, oh, hey, I'm in Nigeria or I'm in Brazil, like I can't get a credit card and I haven't been able to use any of this AI stuff. This is the first thing I've been able to do because I can like use Bitnob or I can use like whatever in order to swap my money into Bitcoin and just pay for you as you're using it. Like I had no idea that that's where they're coming from because I don't know anything about them except for they paid me, right? So that's kind of like a big overview of like AI and Lightning, sort of the intersection between those two. So hopefully it's kind of a good starter.
That was a great starter. And I think that last anecdote they just shared really shows the power of this, like opening up these tools to markets that don't have access to them because of the incumbent payments infrastructure, which when you think about the impact that could have, not only of those individual communities, but the world overall, if you get smart people who are just limited by their access to technology and services, you finally get them access to that stuff. It's crazy to think what could come of that. Yeah. But as you were prefacing that, I think to dive more deeply into what's going on the Lightning side of things specifically, you mentioned L402. And so let's jump into that. Obviously, I mean, LSATs, they had to rebrand to L402. Ryan Gentry was telling me the law, the legal apparatus here in the United States, really the tests that lawyers take to become lawyers, the LSAT had to say, hey, you can't call your protocol LSAT, unfortunately. So they renamed it to L402. It's been around for a while. Lightning Labs has been utilizing it in a few of their products, but it seems like they had a major release last week, which implemented it into a popular AI development kit, LangChain. And so what's going on? It's L402. What is Aperture, and why is it really big that it's now in LangChain?
Yeah, sure. So LangChain is basically, so like now we can kind of go into like the specifics of like how people are using these models. Is that one of the things that we figured out is that you can take the models and you can feed them back into each other and you can feed their outputs to each other. And so what agents are, and that's what people have been working a lot with, there hasn't been a lot of production deployments of them yet, but like it's something that people are experimenting with and I think is a really good use case for Lightning, is that you basically have one model that's operating as like a planner, and then he takes your task and splits it out into subtasks. And then that agent, that model output can be fed into a bunch of different agents beneath it. So this one is like an agent that can access the internet. And so maybe it does a web browse, like it interacts with the web. And so it gets some information from there and it goes back. And then it has you have an agent that when you're basically, the way these agents work is that they're just large language models that you're passing in specific personas and like, hey, you are this, these are your capabilities, and this is how you access the APIs that you have available to you, right? And it can output code, which you can then execute, for example. And so what these agents is that you can create an agent and then have it go do stuff for you, right? And so what's really cool about the L402 integration with LangChain, which is like the LangChain Bitcoin tools, if anyone look it up, I think it's like github.com/lightninglabs/LangChain Bitcoin tools, is that LangChain is this kind of framework that people are using in AI for building out these applications where it's like, hey, I want to take an input and feed it into this large language model and then clean the output and feed that into another model and then have it browse to the web and then give the output. Is what people call that is chain. And so LangChain is a way to chain these different large language models together with just the rest of your code and your application that you're doing. And LangChain Bitcoin tools is a way to have that agent and have that model. One of the tools that you're giving it is tying it into a Lightning node and saying, this is the capabilities that you have of being able to access it, so it can output code and execute that code in order to send and receive Bitcoin payments, for example, on your behalf. And so currently the way everyone's kind of playing around with agents is maybe they exist for like, 7-10 seconds or whatever it is, right? But if you want to have longer running agents, like something that's just sitting in the background doing stuff for you, one of the things that people have found with building out these agent models is the agents using these models is that the more specialized you make the agent, the better the performance is, right? So like, back to military terminology, I think about it as like weapon to target match, which is that you make a very specialized agent with specialized skills. And when you ask it to do something, it's very good at doing that thing, right? But the problem that people are running into is, okay, well, if I make all these specialized different agents, right? How do I have like an orchestrator agent across them? And how do I like host access to all of those things? And this is just kind of like going back to economics, is that the way that you coordinate value transfer and the way that you get things done in an economy with very specialized agents, with very specialized actors, so you have money as the intermediate value transfer layer between them. And so this is like the thing you can do with Unchained Bitcoin tools is you can give the initial planner agent a wallet and say, hey, these are the things you have access to. This is how much money you have. You can go hit against services. You can pay for them. You can give these things to those. And so this is what we think is, and that I'm very excited for. I've seen a lot of cool projects that are getting started, built out for the hackathon for this, is that Langchain Bitcoin tools and just like giving agents access to Bitcoin wallets is going to be sort of the best interaction layer for using agents, because you can have all these specialized agents that get paid in Bitcoin. Or like, this is something that's really exciting, and Stackwork's been doing some work on this. I've seen a couple projects working on this for the hackathon, is that the agent can identify, oh, I don't have the tools to complete this. I'm going to post a bounty using that Bitcoin that you gave me to get a human to complete this part of it, and then feed that back into myself so I can continue with what I was doing, right? And so sort of just agents specifically are one of these places where Bitcoin is like a very, very useful tool that you can give them in order to make them do the things that you want.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. And I mentioned this to Balaji before I recorded with him last month. Is it seems like via the emergence of the Lightning Network and now L402 and these Langchain Bitcoin tools that Lightning's produced, like the machine payable web is finally viable. Like it makes sense to go after that particular I don't want to say use case, I guess you can say, but that particular market of machines paying each other. And
yeah. Well, this is something I woke up and realized was that because I'd exposed my OpenAI key via these Bitcoin payments, right? And so I woke up and I had like a $2,000 bill from OpenAI, right? Because I was like, oh, hey, like a bunch of people are using this thing now because I just left it on GPT-4, right? And so each one of those calls is between 3 and 6 cents, right? And depending on how many dozens of tokens that you're doing. And like a bunch of people have been using it. Like I had it running for the entirety of Prague when we did the pop-up Federation as like one of the Fedi mods. And so people were able to like click into that and just ask some questions and stuff. And when they were doing that, the entire time it was like, hey, they're just passing along Bitcoin payments to me, right? And so I see my OpenAI key is like, oh, hey, my expenses are like, I've got $2,000 in expenses or whatever. And then I look at my Bitcoin wallet and it's like $2,020, right? And I'm like, okay, well, this is like something that becomes really cool with this is that once you have payments for all of these APIs, and this is something that people are running into because everybody is scraping everybody else's data for training sets and stuff, right? Like Twitter, if you remember last week, they were like, hey, we're going to gate access to this stuff now, and you can only hit a certain number of times. And the reason why is because everybody's trying to like scrape against Twitter in order to generate training data and those sorts of things. Is that when you gate something behind a payment for the API, then the concept of spam kind of goes away, right? And the reason why is because every single time someone's hitting me, I'm passing the cost along to them, and I can add like a small profit to that or whatever. I can do like, you know, if it costs me 10 cents, then I can have 10 cents, convert that to sats, and then add like, you know, like half a sat or add like 2 sats or something, right? Is that I can pass that cost along to the user. And so I just don't care about how many people are hitting my service because I'm always profitable. Is that just hit me more, right? Is like, hey, show up at my website, interact with the chatbot, right? Like you're passing along the cost as you do it. And so it becomes this really cool, like kind of change of pace for it, right? Because this is something talking with some of the like more like AI focused guys who they've run into this issue where the moment that they deploy something with GPT-4 in it and it becomes popular, well, they wake up the next day and they've had, hey, I've got like $2,000 or $20,000 worth of OpenAI expenses. But then the problem is they don't have a monetization mechanism for it. Or if they do have a monetization mechanism, maybe it's Stripe, and maybe like, hey, 20% of those things become chargebacks or something, right? And so it just becomes a super, super cool abstraction layer of whenever you want to do any of these AI calls, is that you can pass along the cost along to the user. And so people start taking in and they start using Bitcoin for all of this AI stuff. And then as you're passing those payments along and stuff, the reason why they're doing it is because of the speed associated with it and because it's a bearer instrument with final settlement. But we sort of backdoor in is that, hey, a sender on Lightning achieves perfect privacy. Well, not perfect privacy, right? But very, very good privacy, especially relative to the current solution, which is this is my name, this is my credit card information, this is my address, right? So like that was what initially was really excited about the, and it's been really cool seeing people building out projects for the hackathon that kind of like show this works, right? And so
yeah, no, I mean It's going to be massive, I think. And like I kept positing this at the summit last week, like how long is going to take before a large percentage of, or if not a majority of transactions on the Lightning Network are machine to machine payments of agents going around and completing tasks on behalf of humans, or maybe even other agents if things get really heady. But like it really does open up this digital economy that was not possible, like you said before. And the use case that you brought up of terms of giving people access to your GPT-4 key, you made $20 on that. Like, and that's another thing. Like if you're providing the service of access to the key, which is giving others privacy, like you could charge a little premium on that and probably make a bit more money on top of that, which is a great economic incentive. And then on top of that, like, I guess the big question is like, that will OpenAI ever get to a point where like, hey, we don't like this. This is weird that you're paying on behalf of thousands of people. Or is that sort of how it works anyway if you're building apps on
Yes,
OpenAI?
you normally build out applications, right? And so like I have an API key and I hit against a service and, you know, I pass along from my users or whatever. And like, I'm a client of that person. And so then, you know, if it's like over smaller than microtransactions or something, then like maybe I would have to know some more about them depending on the service that I'm offering them and those kinds of things. Right. But like the thing that I think that this is still like nothing's really in production in terms of like the agents. There's like some stuff that's like starting to roll out. But the big thing for it, and you'll notice this when you start playing around with these applications, is that they're all like, hey, bring your own API key, or this is how you run this yourself, or it's sign up with a credit card in order to get access to any of this stuff. And the reason why everyone's doing that is just because of the cost associated with doing this. And so it's been super exciting for seeing this. And I think we can talk about Aperture for this, is that Aperture is something that Lalu built and Lightning Labs put out. And they just did a new release for it where it's called a reverse proxy, is that you hit against Aperture the exact same way you would normally hit against the API. But the only difference is that you just don't put the authorization key, basically, is that you don't have an OpenAI API key, but you hit against the Aperture reverse proxy exactly the way that you would hit against OpenAI's API. And what happens on the Aperture side is what that's doing is gating it with a micropayment on the Lightning side, and then attaching whoever the developer who's running the Aperture proxy, attaching his API key, and then completing your call for you and passing it back along. And so that's just been that concept of that. Like, you know, I can take my API key and then I can just wrap it with Bitcoin so that anybody can hit against it and then hit against using that API key. They can hit against whatever service they want, right? Using the other one. That becomes a really cool abstraction layer for developers who want to start using this technology, but they can't get access to credit cards. They can't get access to OpenAI keys, or like maybe they live in a country where they're not even allowed to have those services, right? And so that's been super, super cool to see.
Yeah, like I've played around with godmode.space, which is an AI agent tool to try to get an agent to do something simple like, hey, I've got this website, feed them TFTC.io, like look around and see how I can improve the SEO strategy. Like what tags can I be adding to improve the SEO and get it in front of an audience of Bitcoiners or people looking to learn about Bitcoin. And it's been about a month or two since I last tested it and really wasn't able to complete the task. It was probably because I'm not that good of a prompty quite yet, but you can see it's there. Like I was watching this agent, like go into Google, scrape certain websites for keywords, scrape my website. Like it was insane to watch it go and do things on command. But like, yeah, like you said, I'd get an OpenAI, get my API token, put it in there. It was like a very clunky process. It wasn't really straightforward.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, like just yesterday I was at a meeting with someone and they were proposing that, hey, I think the thing that's going to happen is people are going to have single sign-ons with their API keys, right? Of like, hey, you log into the website and then it passes along to this. And I was like, no, like the solution for this is that you just pay for stuff as you use it, right? And so because like, just like think about it from the developer perspective even, right? Of that it's like, oh, hey, I have to go hit against somebody else's API key and I have to like go along there, or like they're passing their API key to me so that I can complete a call for them or whatever. And it's just like, this is one of those issues where, I mean, it's crazy. Like, this is like what people basically do with credit cards too, right? Where like when you swipe a credit card, you're basically giving that dude root access to whoever you're like, wherever you swipe it, to be able to charge whatever they want, right? And then it's a bigger problem with debit cards, right? But that's not the way that we should be doing this. The way that we should be doing this is that you provide me an invoice and I pay the invoice for the service that you're providing for me. And so I can do that. Like I can do that, and I can do it with Lightning. So it's an instant finally settled micropayment. And because of that, I don't have any risk of a chargeback. I can charge down to a couple millisatoshis. Like I could probably do over a millisatoshi because those aren't real, right? That's the joke, right? But like you can do it that way, or you can do that. Like this is like what the L402 specification like normally recommends, and that this is, I've seen a lot of success with people implementing this, is that you just have them initially do a call, they do a payment for like 1 cent or something, and that might be up, that gives them credit for doing like 10 or 15 different calls to Stable Diffusion or something. But because you have this really cool infrastructure built out with Lightning, where this is like, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but this isn't 2018 anymore, right? Is that Lightning is reliable. Lightning has infrastructure around it. Like you can spin up a voltage node in a couple minutes, right? And start connecting out to channels if you're a developer, if you wanted to if you wanted to host via voltage. If you wanted to host like a core Lightning node, like I've got templates set up for that, you can just like run a core Lightning node out of a REPL, right? Is that this is not 2018 anymore, where like, hey, 90% of the payments were failing and like all that sort of thing. Is that like it's a really clean user experience of like having the payment just be done in the background, or just like you do the initial payment for like 0.01 cent, and then you just do the payments in the background as the user is navigating around your site with like Albi or Fedi or whatever. Like the things that we've kind of been building out for the last 2 years, I think I have a really cool intersection with this new computing paradigm of AI, where we can take all the stuff that we've already built, and because we were focusing on payments, we weren't focusing on like Web3 stuff of putting real estate on the blockchain or whatever, right? Now we have this really robust payments infrastructure that we can take and we can apply to this, where this problem where everyone is running into of how do I monetize this stuff effectively, right?
Yeah, I had this epiphany last week at the summit as well, is because like a lot of people in Bitcoin are like, the shit coins are going to come back. Next wave is going to be crypto and AIs and tokens specific for AI functions. And I was pushing back on the people saying this, because like, I don't think the dev tool ecosystem, it won't be as robust if you're spinning up a token and trying to smash it into AI. Like the tooling around Lightning specifically that's been built out over the last 5 years, I think has a significant head start in terms of actually providing utility and value to these AI companies at the end of the day.
Yeah, and this is the kind of like why Bitcoin, and like this is something, a universal reaction that I would get like as a Bitcoiner working at like OKCoin and OKX, right? Was that the reaction I would get is like, hey, why are you focusing on payments? Why are you so focused on money, right? There's all this other stuff you can tokenize, right? The reason why is because money is like the single most valuable thing out there. It's like half of every problem, right? Of like, hey, there's the problem and there's the relative value of that problem compared to everything else. And the money is what we're using to make that relative valuation, like in a larger economy and this economic model, right? And so the fact that we've been focusing on making really, really good payments and using a money that can't be corrupted is like really starting to pay off, because now when people are saying, hey, how do I monetize this thing? I want to use the best payment technology, which has the best user experience. Like Lightning currently is like, there's all sorts of hard edges on the user experience, but specifically around like the dev experience of, hey, I have a Lightning address. I can hit against it to get an invoice, make sure that invoice is paid, and then complete the service. That specifically, I've seen tons and tons of people who know nothing about Bitcoin, not very interested in Bitcoin, and they can be like, oh, wait, I can do this, and then I can immediately start getting payments. And I don't have to, as a web developer, like sign up for and like take all the information from all my users and pass it along to Stripe, right? Like I can just have a transaction with them. Like it's a really great experience for them. And I think that's something that there's like a lot of hard edges around Lightning still and stuff that's like getting ironed out. But that's something that works. That's something that can be done at scale. That's something that we can show up to different dev communities for and say, hey, this is immediately how you can start getting paid and monetize your existing applications.
Yeah, Stripe better keep their head on a swivel, because it seems like this could disrupt them rather quickly if Bitcoin catches on. And if it does catch on, or you might want to get some just in case it does catch on. Blundered that one. But no, thinking heady here, Just like as you're describing this, like having ideas, maybe you're a company that doesn't want to take on the volatility risk of Bitcoin. Could you like auto forward the paid Lightning invoices to something like a Fedi stability pool and
Yeah, I think
automatically?
for right now, that doesn't exist, but that's clearly like me personally, like working on this is something that I want to build and something that I think would be very useful and something that yeah, like I think that's because we were just talking about that earlier of that the price risk associated with Bitcoin is like an additional factor that kind of gets in the way of some people who would otherwise be more open to adopting Bitcoin. And that's one of the things that I think that was the big unlock that Galloway proved was that for the Galloway Bitcoin Beach wallet and now Blink wallet, is that once you added in the stable dollar price, that was a big adoption mechanism for merchants because merchants, they have a hard enough time just the operational side of their business. They also don't want to have to be investors, right? And like this is like one of the great evils of fiat, right? Is it kind of turns everybody into an investor, is that they have to constantly be thinking about like, okay, well, I can't just hold money, so I have to go speculate on like whether a stock is going to go up or buy some real estate and hopefully that goes up and that sort of thing. Is that if you can get rid of the price volatility of Bitcoin as part of the adoption process for it, like that's a huge unlock for a lot of people where, hey, I don't have to also do the price volatility. I can't emphasize that enough in terms of like, I saw this a lot with trying to get Afghan refugees initially when I started with them. Cause like, you know, I'm a hardcore Bitcoiner and like, I didn't have a lot of like empathy and experience when I like first met them, but like seeing the problem that they were running into, which was that, hey, I just need to get like money from here to here, right? And like I need it to be worth the same just because like I know I need to get this amount and I need to get that to that person and then he has that amount. But like in the intermediate process of like 2 days between like, hey, when they receive the payment and when they have to do the like get the service on the other side or whatever, right? If the price moves by like 5% or 10% or whatever, like that's something that just gets in the way. It's like it's not something that people need, and it's something that kind of complicates the interactions and the process of like being an operating business. And so if you can lock in the US dollar prices of Bitcoin and use Bitcoin just as the rails for all of these payments, right? Then operating businesses, they don't have to also add the Bitcoin price volatility as part of like the complexity of running a business anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. It's if you can create a user experience where they're able to use Bitcoin. I mean, obviously Strike is working on this and others, but that's what's really cool about this space is there different experiences at different parts. Obviously Strike's connection between Lightning and the incumbent banking system, what you guys are building at Fedi with these stability pools and using the Lightning Network as a gateway. I think it really does show how dynamic Bitcoin can be and how it can be utilized in many different ways. And the fact that many people think Bitcoin isn't innovating is mind blowing to me. Because when you describe everything you just did, whether it be at the Fedimint level or the interaction between Lightning and AI, like it's increasingly becoming very obvious that this is going to be one of the most disruptive payment and savings technologies that's ever existed on the planet.
Yeah, well, this is something for specifically within Bitcoin, right? Of that, there's a lot of stuff. I think when when people say, "Hey, there's nothing happening in Bitcoin" or whatever, is that normally what we're working on, right? Is we're just making better payments mechanisms, right? And so when people are like, "Oh, hey, you made it so payments are faster," like that's not like a huge thing for a lot of people or something like that, right? And so I think that's kind of where they're coming from. Like, "Hey, why are you spending all this time on payments? There's like all this other stuff you could be doing and that sort of thing," but now it's kind of really coming to show of that all of the work that we did on making this really robust payment structure, that was the thing that is missing on everything else, right? And so because we have that and we can like, I mean, it's a crazy experience, right? It's like you show up at somebody and you say, hey, you know, that whole monetization problem that you have, like this is an out of the box, incredibly good solution where you can instantly get paid for the costs that you incur and pass those along to your user, right? And you don't have to like store their information. Like they don't have to, you don't have to know anything about them except for the fact that they paid you, right? And so that's something that we can do that none of these other like crypto projects and stuff can. And the reason why was because they went off and were doing all sorts of other things, right? And now it's really coming to show of that, hey, like just having the better money is a very important aspect of this, right? It's like, yeah, sure, you can do, and maybe I don't know, if, like, yeah, well, we can talk about this too, right? Of that, the differences between Bitcoin and crypto, and like some of all this other stuff that they're doing, where Bitcoin at the base layer is Turing incomplete and something that you can analyze and that you can know the security behind. You can actually analyze this at rest, right? This is actually something within AI, which is getting pretty interesting, is that George Hotz is working at TinyCorp. And he's like, hey, we're trying to like get Turing completeness out of the stack, just like sort of how Bitcoin at the base layer doesn't have Turing completeness, because then we can sort of like analyze it and we can actually make it like use it as a building block for building other abstractions on top of without being worried about, oh, there's this crazy stuff going on underneath. And if you go back to sort of the history of Bitcoin, like one of my favorite things is going back through all of your Ethereum move to proof of stake sort of tweet history. Is if you go back to there, like the big thing that they wanted at the base layer for Ethereum and a lot of these other coins is they wanted Turing completeness. And the reason why was because they said, hey, we're not going to build in layers. The way we're going to build is plugging everything on the base layer. Of that, you get Turing completeness, you get smart contracts, you get all that sort of stuff, right? And now that's really starting to show. And the reason why is because now that you have this really robust payment infrastructure, which we were able to build on top of in a secure way, because Bitcoin at the base layer optimizes for security, at the Lightning layer, it's optimizing for like I said, like there's trade-offs associated with it, right? But it's like trying to do like very fast payment mechanism or instant final settlement of a bearer instrument, right? Is that a lot of these other chains, so they're like, okay, well now we want to add in the payment stuff or whatever. Well, now we're getting to the point where we can't do that at the base layer. So we're going to do a layer 2. And the problem with a lot of these layer 2s is that they're not mutually compatible, right? So it's not like we have a rail between them like Lightning. Like, you know, if you've got like one roll up section on like using Optimism or whatever, right? And you've got like a separate type of roll up, those things are incompatible and they have to resolve back to the base chain in order to move across, right? Not like an instant finally settled payment like Lightning where you can just like zap in between the two. And so this is something that people are running into. And so what's the other element for it is that because we've got inscriptions now, right? And I know that there's like different opinions about inscriptions, is that you can now use Bitcoin as a data availability layer. And so even though some of these other chains, they're like, oh, hey, now we're building our own layer 2s. Well, the thing that the layer 2 needs the base chain for is for data availability and as like an arbitration mechanism, right? And so you can take some of these layer 2 stuff. This is already starting to happen. Eric Wall's been working a little bit about this, right? And is like taking sovereign rollups and eventually ZK rollups, right? And taking those and just using Bitcoin as the data availability layer for it. And so now all of the other stuff, like all the other cryptos where they realize that, hey, you should be building in a layered model. Well, now they have all these problems at the base layer because they have Turing completeness inside of there and like other like complexities and difficulties. And so they try to build a second layer. But now because Bitcoin can operate as the data availability layer, well, you could just take that same second layer, move it onto Bitcoin, and then put it there, right? And then if you want to move from that second layer to a different layer 2 or whatever, like, you know, zap into Liquid or zap into a Fedimint or whatever, right? That as long as you make it compatible with Lightning, you can instantly move between these different sort of like top levels, right? And so it's got a big can of worms I just opened there, right? But that's I mean, this is like, I've heard a couple of people say this, right? Is like, there's never been a better time to be a Bitcoin dev, right? Because there was a long time where we were thinking, oh, hey, like, are we wrong? Like, a lot of these crypto companies are getting a bunch of money and they seem to be getting like a lot more developers there and stuff. Like, there's never been a better time to be a Bitcoin dev because we've got the infrastructure, we've got sort of like the roadmap of like, this is what we can build now, this is where it's going in the future, and we can start building in that direction for it.
Yeah, Lightning's the connective tissue between all this stuff, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if you've used it yet, but the Bolts exchange is like, this is kind of like the first time where people have been able to use Liquid in like a productive way, right? I mean, there was other stuff they were doing, but just like on a day-to-day basis, right? It was like kind of annoying because I'd have to like swap in order to get back into Liquid or like off of there or something. But now because I can use Lightning as like the rail between those two, I can instantly go in and out of Bitcoin to Liquid. Right. And so now like, you know, like Tiero's companies and Barack and those guys, like they've been doing a bunch of Liquid stuff for a while, but in order to get over there, if you wanted to actually do the movement of Bitcoin over onto Liquid, like it was kind of annoying to do. Right. But now because I can use Lightning to instantly move between the two networks, right, all of a sudden it becomes super interesting of that, oh, maybe I do want to do something with like on the Liquid side using like their more advanced smart contracting. I want to try something out with like check from stack or anything. Right. Some of the more advanced scripting, stuff like that. Because I've got the Lightning layer to move in between those, I can do it instantly. It works really well. But so if I'm on like one of these separate chains, right, well, I can't instantly and finally move between the two different layer 2s over there, right? Because they don't have this like kind of connective tissue between them, like Lightning that we do.
Yeah. Woo, doggy. Seems like it's happening.
It's always been happening, Marty. Is that we're in this slow process of hyper Bitcoinization, and it's it moves in fits and spurts. But like the important thing that's going on, right, is that like we kind of have an answer now for how do we make great money and how do we bring that to a lot of people, and what are the next steps that we need in terms of ushering in kind of more adoption of Bitcoin. Like I think those
Yeah.
were very unclear for a lot of devs for a long time, but I think we're getting to the point where we kind of like see it in the mirror, right? We see it in the distance of like, hey, this is like something. If we continue along this path and we continue operating in this way, then we can continue making incremental progress there, and eventually, like we'll get there, right?
Yeah, and that's why I've been so obsessed with AI. I mean, I was playing like an idiot earlier, but I have been paying attention to AI, its growth, and the convergence with Bitcoin over the last few months, or last 6 months now. But like, it solves such a massive problem for them with the amount of capex they have on the back end and needing to know that they're going to be able to pay that while offering a service to their end users. That it, like, I could see the AI industry being like the first massive adopters of Lightning outside of like Bitcoiners, just who have been playing around with it for the last 5 years. Like, it solves such a massive problem for them that it's a no-brainer, which gets into like the last question. What do you think is needed to tip that industry over the edge? Because obviously a lot of people in artificial intelligence have been very hyper focused narrowly on what they've been doing, understandably so, because it's such a cutting edge technology and it's going to change the world in ways that probably can't imagine right now. So they've been hyper focused on that and probably view Bitcoin as lumped in with the broader crypto industry and something of a scam. But again, after everything you've described, everything we've been paying attention to, everything we've been seeing being built at this intersection, it's a no-brainer. Like, what do you think we need to push some of these AI companies over the edge?
Yeah, the big one, and this is like the reaction that I've had and why we did this hackathon, which is I know we like you always want to make podcasts evergreen, right? But so specifically, and this is 2023, is that running through the end of July from when this comes out, we were running this hackathon called AI for All, and the idea behind it is to use Bitcoin with AI to build out a bunch of projects that kind of show Bitcoin doing this, right? Because this is one of the things that I think a lot of people run into is when we say Bitcoin fixes this, is that maybe we're talking about this in the future or talking about it abstractly, right? When people talk about like, oh, hey, Bitcoin fixes war or something, right? It's like, yeah, we're talking about it like in the abstract, and eventually, like once we're on a hyper Bitcoinized standard and people become like they lower their time preferences, then people will be less inclined to go to war in order to just like keep the fiat machine moving and stuff, right? But when you say like Bitcoin fixes this, as it applies to AI, there's very clear applications of this that we just need to build it out. And so we're running this hackathon called AI for All. And what we're really hoping comes out of this is a bunch of Bitcoin and AI projects that kind of also just, you can be related to either if you want to do a submission, but like I really hope that you kind of like see both of them of like tying Bitcoin payments in and tying some of the privacy benefits of using Bitcoin to AI, because that's like another big issue. We didn't talk too much about it, right? But that's why we're running this hackathon. And so any devs out there who want to contribute to a project, like we've been doing a bunch of workshops and stuff on like how the AI tools work, how to tie Bitcoin payments in, how to use the L402 specification and stuff. And so anybody who's like building anything, like I know there's a bunch of Nostr devs who have been playing around with AI, is like definitely submit a project for that. And at the end of that, for the judging for it, that's going to be our, like, this is, because again, this is the reaction I've been getting when I go to these AI events and I talk about how Bitcoin fixes this. They say, okay, show me. Right. And so I can like show them in the abstract, right? Or I can show them like little demos and stuff. And I can show them, hey, well, this is Aperture. This is just a reverse proxy. You can run it against here and you can do that. But like the biggest way to do that is to just build out a bunch of cool projects that are doing this and are solving this problem and show them. Right. And so we can show up at the, like, you know, the guys running the Bard team at Google and say, hey, like this is a way that we wrapped Bard into Lightning payments, and we are entirely like in the black when we deploy these models, and because we're always getting paid for them, stuff like that, right? And so I really hope that people can help contribute to that one, just because this is one of those like Bitcoin fixes this, but it's Bitcoin fixes this if we build out a bunch of projects that like actually show that it does, and then that can get people excited about it and say, okay, yeah, sure, Bitcoin does fix this problem, and here's an example of it, and this is something that we're going to scale out and do within our own company as well.
Yeah. When this podcast released, which will be tomorrow, July 19th, 2023, you still have 11 days left to contribute to the hackathon.
Totally.
It's
And
like,
we got a bunch of mentors, right? So on the AI side and the Bitcoin side. And so just like hop in the Discord, and we're also running on Pull.Fun. And so just like anybody who wants to, like, even if you just want to like learn and become like, this is something before doing like being the head of developer support at Fedi, like one of the big things that I've been doing is that I've been very active in like teaching Bitcoin and teaching programming and teaching like people who like want to be devs, like how they can start contributing. It's like, this is a really great first opportunity for it, because with all of this AI tooling, especially ChatGPT and like similar instruct models for it that can do code generation, it's never been easier to become a developer. And so a lot of people have been talking about this, where we need more devs in Bitcoin. One way to do that is to take existing devs and move them to Bitcoin. The other way is to take Bitcoiners and turn them into developers. And I think that that's the better model for it, because I think that we're getting to the point where we have the tooling that we can build out, that it doesn't take a lot of effort, especially if you're using something like Replit. Like the time between idea and deployed product is like nothing, right? Like you can make a cool Fedi mod, or you can make a cool WebLN enabled website, and you can wrap in LangChain with it or something. And you can do that in like half an hour, even if you don't know anything about coding, right? And so if you do want to learn to code, or you do want to learn like, how do I start using this stuff? Like this is, I think, a really good opportunity for it. And so I really hope people come out and join.
answer the call, freaks. Answer the goddamn call, please.
Yeah. And this is
but you mentioned it
on the website a little bit. Apparently, it was that it's like AI and Bitcoin, right? So even if you're just working on like cool Bitcoin projects or Nostr projects and stuff, right, is that like we want to see those too, just because, you know, like when we talk about Bitcoin fixes this and Nostr fixes this and like AI fixes this and stuff, this is sort of like the opportunity to show that, right? And
yeah. And I know you mentioned we didn't touch on it, but maybe we should touch on it before we wrap up here, which is the privacy benefits that paying over Lightning. I mean, you mentioned it a couple of times, but I don't think people realize some of the privacy pitfalls that are out there, particularly for companies leveraging other companies' LLMs.
Yeah. So here's a couple of things for it, right? So one of them is that, so let's talk about the privacy that you get on Lightning, right? So there's basically two ways that Lightning gives you good privacy that you can apply to these large language models and stuff, right? One of them is that you can do a login with Lightning, right? And so that actually doesn't touch Lightning, but it's just that when I do a login with Lightning, I can also show that I can make payments, right? So it's a very useful way to do that, of like having a persistent user identity as a developer, making websites where I want the user to have like they can leave and then they come back and all their chat history is there, for example, right? Login with Lightning is a way that they can log in. They're just a public key, right? Is that I don't have to know anything about them except for the fact that they have a private key associated with that public key. They can sign messages. I can encrypt things based off of those public keys, so I can have encrypted copies of all of like their chats, or like I don't have to store anything unencrypted. I don't have to store any information about my user if I don't want to, right? So that's one element of it. The other element of it is sender-side privacy, is that when you're sending on the Lightning Network, you achieve very good privacy because of the onion route associated with it. So if people don't know what onion routing is, like if you've ever heard of Tor as like it's a private way of using the internet. Tor stands for the onion router. And onion routing is that when you're using the internet, you have multiple hops. So it's me, and then I hit off a router at this place, which hits another router, which hits another router, which finally lands at Marty, right? And so normally that's a ClearNet route, and so you can just see the packet moving along. But with onion routing, every single hop along there, you can think about it like an onion, where every layer of the onion can only see the layer underneath and the layer on top of it. And so when I'm sending a payment on Lightning, and I'm onion routing that payment, and so I'm hitting one hop and then another hop and then another hop, and each one of those hops doesn't know where it ends up. They just know where it came from and where the next hop is. And when I'm receiving on Lightning, I can't see where it came from. I can just see the final hop that it came along with. So as a sender on Lightning, I achieve very good privacy. As a receiver on Lightning, I have worse privacy. And the reason why is because I have to tell you what node to send it to, right? And so now you can go look at that node's channels. You can see what their balances are. You can probe against that node in order to figure out what its side balances are and those kinds of things. All the work that Tony's been doing, he's at Muni now, but before that, when he was doing all of his Lightning privacy research, all of those things. If that on a sender, as a sender on Lightning, I achieve very good privacy. As a receiver on Lightning, I don't have very good privacy. and this is like a joke within Lightning, right? Is that the slowest part of the Lightning network is all of the Chainalysis API calls from all of the nodes you're hitting along the way, right? So like even though like separate from the protocol is that the guys running the nodes, if they're like industrial level operators or whatever, like they're hitting against Chainalysis in order to do the know your transaction for it and stuff. Right. And so, but as a sender on Lightning, I have very good privacy. And so even though they're doing those calls or whatever, and even though I'm hitting along that route, is that I have really good privacy and I can do a login with Lightning. So I can log into a website and I can send you payments and you don't have to know anything about me except a public key associated with me. Right. And so that's like on the why Lightning is good on the privacy solution for these. So now we talk about on the AI side of what are the privacy implications of doing this stuff is that everybody is scraping everybody else all the time for training data. And the other element for it is that every time that you hit against a third party, like they have some agreements that say, hey, we're not going to use you for this training data and stuff. And like, you're just trusting them that they're not saving a copy of this or they're doing that. But people are already running into these issues where you're hitting against a third party model like OpenAI or Claude or anything like that. And when you're just copying stuff over, you're also copying like customer information, or you're copying like API keys, or you're copying like code, which is not open source. This is like held behind your company and stuff, right? Is that you really want to be able to run these models locally, right? And so then, because if they're running locally, nothing leaves your computer. But the problem becomes of, okay, if I'm running it locally, then I need access to a graphics card. And most people, some people have access to graphics cards, right? And they just find this very easy. But there's no very good way to do that, right? And so this is like kind of where Fedimint comes back in, of that at the Federation, you can host some of these like GPUs and stuff that you can run local models for. And it doesn't go all the way to OpenAI or like a third party or some like host in like a country that's entirely separate from you. Is that you're hitting it against a locally run model at your Federation level. And so in the event that like something happens or like your data leaks or anything like that, right? It's like, they're still within the Federation, they're still within your community. They're close enough that you can socially sanction them, right?
Yeah, which is fascinating. And in that Fedi model where you're crowdsourcing GPUs, the GPUs are getting access to like the best LLMs.
Yeah, so I mean that's the idea behind it, right? Is that at the Federation level, when you're pooling community resources, right, is that you can do things that you as an individual might not be able to. And so like if you want to get access to like a bunch of A100s or whatever, right, like those are like $3,000 to $5,000 graphics cards. And so like there's a lot of people who can afford that. There's more people who can't. And so you want to be able to have like maybe one person buys that or the community buys it and they host it in some place and then they just get access to it at the Fedimint level, right? And so within the Federation, like they can sign up and maybe like the Federation's gating the API key or something. There's different implementations you could do for this, right? But then you can gate access to the hosted community resource. And then maybe like the person who's providing it or whatever, they get a cut or you get like a discount if you're doing it. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. The whole point of Fedimint is that it's just like like create your own optimized federated application, right? Of that you're running this Fedimint and you're choosing the modules that run with it. And when people join in, you can choose like what they have access to and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is running a GPU similar to running an ASIC where, yes, you may have 3 ASICs or 30,000, but you're still contributing to the open Bitcoin protocol on the GPU side of things. Like, can you point your GPUs at OpenAI or...
you can't do that specifically, but what you can
do, build your own LLMs.
Well, so basically the large language model consists of two things, right? There's like basically the configuration of this is like the parameters that we're using for this thing, right? Of like the neural network that we're using. Basically like this is like the description of like the general outline of this thing. And you have the weights, which is the specifics of, okay, well now you combine like the general outline and you apply the weights to it. And then you can run this model locally of like, this is what the graphics card is doing, right? And so like just today, Llama 2 came out, which is like the newest version of Facebook's model. And like that's entirely open source, available for commercial use. So that's going to be very exciting because Llama 2 is kind of the closest thing that people have on the open source side to something like ChatGPT, right? And so that's something where you would run that locally on the graphics card. And so the graphics card in the same way that it's not like hitting out against this separate service. It's just everything is happening on that graphics card, right? And
it makes sense because a Fedi community would be smaller than the overarching universe of people calling open APIs. So don't need as many GPUs. Okay. Yeah, now I got it.
Right.
All right.
And also the benefit you get there is that it's like the data that you're pushing over them is only so this is why we say Fedi is like allocating your money, your data, your digital life across these different federations, right? Is that I can say, okay, these are the passwords you have access to. These are the identities you have access to associated with me when I'm in this federation, right? And then I can go hit against this separate federation. I could like strip out all that identity stuff in order to use the more powerful model that they're using, and then get the output, feed it back into what I'm doing over there, for example.
Oh yeah, so this is actually a good way to bootstrap open source AI versus
Totally.
closed source.
And everyone's running this issue of like, how do I run this stuff locally, right? And like, there's some people who are like, oh hey, well, how do I run this stuff locally consists of how do I get it running on my $5,000 MacBook, right? But then how do I run this stuff locally when you're talking to somebody in Nigeria, for example, or like Togo, or talking to somebody in like Mexico, or even talking to somebody who's like not a developer in Silicon Valley right now, right? Is that how do I run this locally? It becomes, okay, how do I even afford the infrastructure or like do the setup in order to get the GPUs set up such that I can do this? Because like I can't afford like the $3,000 or $5,000 graphics card. I want to amortize that across like a bunch of uses. Have like one person running a graphics card for a bunch of people, that sort of thing.
Yeah, wow, that's gonna be massive. Got to keep building though.
Yeah, well, this is actually something I've really enjoyed of that. I love this perspective. I think you were the one who first started doing this within Bitcoin of that. When people critique Bitcoin from the environmental perspective, it's like you chuckle to yourself and you plug in more ASICs. Is that this exact same thing has kind of been going on within AI. There's all the safetyism stuff within AI. And then there's the guys who kind of chuckle to themselves and plug in more graphics cards. And it's been really cool to see that sort of like parallel and sort of like the same attitude. There's like this whole crew of AI guys who are sort of take the same approach as like the Bitcoin of like, hey, we're just going to keep building this stuff, right? And so like you can critique it and you can try to stop us, right? But like, anybody with a graphics card is going to be able to do this stuff, right? Some people say, oh, we're going to gate access to AI and all these things, right? It's like, yeah, well, everyone has access to it. And, you've got federations so that even people who don't have access to like graphics themselves can also like access these things at like a community level, that sort of thing. It's like, it's very fun. It's very cool seeing the culture kind of mirror across the two.
Yeah. It's almost like there should be like a convergence,
Yeah. AI for all hackathon through the end of July.
Go check it out, freaks. I've been keeping it for like 2.5 hours now. We were a half hour late in hitting record here, but time flies when you're having fun. This has been an incredible conversation.
Well, it's been really cool to talk to you, Marty. I mean, like you've been someone who's been very instrumental in my Bitcoin journey. And so this is big for me as well.
Well, I'm flattered that you consider me instrumental in your journey, as you may be able to tell from this conversation. I'm just a curious dunce trying to learn more about what the hell is going on here.
Yeah, I mean, this is like another, I don't know. I know we have to wrap up and I keep adding these things, right? But it's like, like getting the ego out of the way of like the conversations that you have with new people and like being able to onboard new guys. Like you got people on the podcast who don't know anything about Bitcoin and like you're able to kind of like effectively onboard them. Like that's like a good scaling experience for everybody else who kind of comes into these Bitcoin conversations. And like maybe they're coming from a different perspective. You had like a guest on who's not related to Bitcoin, but the perspective that you're getting is not like, oh, hey, I mean, sometimes you do this, right? But everybody does this, right? On the Bitcoin side is like, well, yeah, you guys are wrong, right? This is why I'm going to explain why you're wrong, right? But like something I think is really cool within TFTC and like a couple of these other Bitcoin podcasts is like kind of like a onboarding mechanism for people is that there's a lot of like ego that kind of gets in the way of a lot of people. And like one of the big things that this was like kind of like the big takeaway from my time in the Marine Corps is that it's like, it's not about you. Is that the moment you start thinking about stuff in terms of like me being right or like me having to be like, this person needs to walk away from this conversation understanding that I am correct about Bitcoin or whatever. It's like the moment you start thinking in that way, it's just absolute poison, right? It's like, it's not about you. It's about the Marines. Like, it's not about you. It's about like the future that we're leaving for our kids, right? Of that, do we want to have them grow up on a sound money standard or do we want them to like grow up under fiat? Right. And so like when you think about it from that perspective and like it comes out a lot in these conversations that you have is that like, people will like do things and you're being like, okay, well, like ego aside, like let's do the answer. Right.
Yeah. I think I've developed that skill slowly but surely over 6 years. I was one of those, I'm right, you're wrong. Have fun staying poor guys for a bit there in the beginning.
And then Matt got you to stay humble and stack sats. So
yes. I mean, if you say it incessantly for 5 years straight to somebody, it'll begin to internalize. Kody, thank you for doing what you do, sir. I mean, it's honestly very impressive going back to you finding Bitcoin in 2020, getting to the point you are now with Fedi and being able to explain this stuff with breadth and depth pretty clearly and succinctly. That was the one thing I was really impressed about your demo in Nashville last week is, number one, you can tell you're a Marine. You can control a room and really force people to hone in and listen. And then you did a very good job of just explaining everything and making sure everybody was keeping up. And I think you're a massive value add to the space. I'm extremely pumped for the Fedi team that they have you working for them.
Well, again, like not about me, right? Like this is about Bitcoin. And
Exactly.
so
Exactly. It's true.
Stay humble, sack sats. It's not about you.
All right. Get back to work. That's peace of love, freaks. Sticky.